This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It's 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we find ourselves in uncharted waters. Two of the politicians who have arguably featured most prominently on this programme over our years of chronicling together the largely self-inflicted national decline, starting, I suppose, in 2016 with that Brexit vote, reaching a culmination of sorts in 2019 with the 80-seat majority delivered to Boris Johnson, in part by Nigel Farage's decision to stand down candidates from whatever his vehicle of self-promotion was called at the time, to today, when they are essentially engaged in the inevitable circular firing squad that some of us have been expecting for some time, but which, if I'm brutally honest with you, I was expecting to enjoy rather more than I currently am. It began with Farage's comments about Vladimir Putin and Russia. Again, regular listeners to this programme will have been among the least surprised consumers of the so-called news that Farage is a big fan of Vladimir Putin's. His admiration for the man's conduct is on the record, and the claim that somehow the decision to invade Ukraine had been prompted by the European Union and or NATO is as well documented as it is disgusting. Now, this prompted Boris Johnson to accuse Nigel Farage of a form of moral repugnance, which, for the first and quite possibly last time in history, put Nigel Farage in the position of having a valid grievance, because he is perfectly entitled to point out that Boris Johnson has a long and distinctly unproud track record of also blaming the European Union for the invasion of Ukraine. He did it explicitly during the 2016 referendum debates. And of course, he subsequently, as Foreign Secretary, visited the palazzo of a former KGB spy. Quick quote from Vladimir Putin: "There is no such thing as a former KGB spy," and subsequently put said spy's son in the House of Lords against the advice of the House of Lords Appointments Committee. So Farage could reasonably kick back and accuse Boris Johnson of hypocrisy. Of course, it leaves them both culpable. It doesn't leave one of them exonerated of the claim of being a Kremlin apologist. It actually puts them both in the position of effectively promoting or regurgitating Kremlin talking points. So they are both, if you like, by their own standards, they are both morally repugnant, which is a moment I didn't quite see coming in such clear and categorical terms. So when Nigel Farage calls Boris Johnson a liar and a hypocrite, he is correct, but he is also engaging in perhaps the best recorded case in modern political history of a pot calling a kettle black. And it puts us in a weird position, doesn't it? It puts us in a position where we have to puzzle over which one of them might be more morally repugnant. Yesterday, there was an example when Farage claimed that Sadiq Khan hates England because of a rule that prevents London cab drivers from flying England flags, a rule that was introduced when Boris Johnson was Mayor of London in 2012. So quite how you could hold up a law introduced by Boris Johnson as proof that a brown-skinned Mayor of London hates England, I'm afraid only Nigel Farage could tell you. But I can't help wondering quite how relevant the ethnicity of said mayor would be to the claim that somebody hates England. I saw it described as a dog whistle so loud that even Zach Goldsmith, the former Mayor of London candidate who ran a racist campaign against Sadiq Khan and subsequently got put in the House of Lords by Boris Johnson. So it's almost as if every rock you look under when comparing these two characters to each other reveals more rocks under which you then have to look. And I don't know at this point in proceedings which way the voting is going to go. I don't know which way your calls are going to steer me. I don't even know whether I should have an opinion at this point on which one is worse, which one is more morally repugnant. The number you need to join in is 0345 6060973. I want to remind you that this is actually a serious conversation. So I want you to ring in with your examples, your evidence-based examples of exactly what prompts your conclusion that Johnson is more morally repugnant than Farage, or Farage is more morally repugnant than Johnson. I think, and it pains me to say this, I think that you may well have more facts at your fingertips than some of the professional commentators in this case, because whether they do it through a lack of space or a lack of integrity or a lack of motivation, I don't see either of these people being described with reference to some of their, I suppose you could loosely describe some of their greatest hits. Farage, of course, remains a cheerleader for an adjudicated rapist and convicted criminal. Donald Trump, his failure to answer questions about the attempts to incite anarchy on January the 6th after the last American presidential elections continue to pepper this campaign trail. President Zelensky has come forward to, no less, to accuse Nigel Farage of being infected with Putinism, and yet, of course, Boris Johnson somehow managed to cast himself as a great champion of Ukraine, despite his long history of also echoing Kremlin talking points. So where do you go in on it? Do you go in on the lies in Boris Johnson's case, up to and including in and to the House of Commons? Or do you go in on the racist dog whistling, the race baiting? Both of them have a long and detailed track record in both areas. Do you go in on... what do you go in on? There's so much to choose from, which is why I'm particularly looking forward to what you decide to put on the table. So we'll assemble evidence, we'll record votes, we will demand your vote won't count unless you have got evidence-based support for your position. And lest anyone think this is an unduly flippant approach to serious matters, I would remind you that properly chronicling how this country became a place where two of the most significant political figures of the last 10 years can be publicly and accurately describing each other as morally repugnant, despite the fact that they agree with each other on all of the major issues of the moment, up to and including apologism for Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the parroting of Kremlin talking points. They are, for the avoidance of doubt, both as guilty as each other of this. So they are bizarrely both as morally repugnant as each other, according to their own assessment of the situation. And yet we have, through, I don't know whether it's media laziness or something more sinister, we've reached a point where nobody really, with present company accepted, has properly chronicled the travel, the journey, the progress seems an inappropriate word, doesn't it? To a place where this can actually happen, to a place where and of course the point is, and I know that you're not really minded to ring me as much these days as you used to. Historically, I have found that both of these men are often warmly regarded by the same people. Boris Johnson fans and Nigel Farage fans. That Venn diagram is not a circle. There are some people who would be warm towards one and cool towards the other. But I think we can probably agree, can't we, that there is a heck of a lot of crossover. An awful lot of people who I think I would probably describe as don't like thinking too deeply about matters political, but have very strong feelings, very passionate feelings about things like foreigners. They have, over the years, demonstrated an affinity with both Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. So in many ways, I would love to get your votes on the board. Perhaps we could call a temporary truce. Yeah, given that I've made my disdain for both of these men pretty clear over the years, and you've made your admiration for both of them, the fact that they are now biting chunks out of each other and I'm compelling you to pick a side means that perhaps we could call a temporary truce, and you could tell me why you think one of your heroes is more morally repugnant than your other hero. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. And just when you thought this circular firing squad couldn't get any more vituperative, Farage claims that he's launched or he's consulted lawyers over a Daily Mail describing him as an ally of Vladimir Putin's administration, despite the fact that the Daily Mail in that case, I'm even defending the Daily Mail now on journalistic grounds, because all they were doing was quoting the Russian Foreign Ministry and indeed quoting the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accurately when he said the virus of Putinism unfortunately infects people. So pick a side. They are accusing each other of being morally repugnant. Draw upon your knowledge, your understanding, your memory of what both of these men have done over the last 10, 20 years, however long they've been in the public space, and let me know your thoughts and indeed your votes. I stress again, I issue this invitation again, if you have historically liked both of them, and perhaps you still do like both of them, if they're calling each other morally repugnant, then which one are you going to side with? I don't know whether this day was always destined to dawn, but I mean, it certainly dawned now. Gloves off, call it what you will. Boris Johnson calls Nigel Farage morally repugnant. Nigel Farage calls Boris Johnson morally repugnant. Significant swathes of the country nod along in full agreement with both of them. But people who have previously considered both men to be admirable or heroic or even honest are forced today to choose a side. And I am, more in hope than expectation, I am very keen to hear from people who are in that category. But whatever category you're in, the invitation is clear. 0345 6060 973. Who is more morally repugnant? Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage?
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:17. Quite a few of you suggesting that this is a little like being asked to choose between constipation and diarrhea. But some people already casting their vote. Nick in Brighton says it has to be Johnson for me, as a lot of his morally repugnant behaviour happened when he was Prime Minister, but it is therefore a close race. Alex says, crikey, James, it's like being asked to choose between being baked or roasted alive. I take your point, but I am going to insist that you actually do choose one. John in Reading suggests it's a dead heat. We'll have to see. Someone's had a classical education, suggesting that it's like watching Scylla and Charybdis fight it out. Both are liars, says Andy, and will say anything about anyone. That's not an answer to the question, though. Which one is worse? If they're calling each other morally repugnant, then who is, if you like, more accurate? And Danny Fitz, I think, wins the best tweet so far, although it's already only 10:18 when he says Nigel Farage hates Venn diagrams because the borders cross. Let's start off, and I will try to keep a proper tally here. Keith, get your pencil out, give your pencil, sharpen your pencil. We're going to try and keep scores on this one if we can. I'm not including text votes yet, but I may start including text votes once we've got some of the testimony in front of the court of public opinion. Let's start with Ben, who's in Alicante. Ben, which one's worse?
For me, James, it's definitely Nigel Farage, and
Why?
It's because of when he was a schoolboy in the upper sixth, I think at Dulwich College. He enjoyed the
Dulwich. Hang on a minute. That's a public school, isn't it? I thought he was a fully paid up sort of man of the people who rejected elites and claimed that only ordinary working people could join the Facebook group of fascists.
And I lived quite close to where he went. I did not go to Dulwich School, by the way. I went to a local comprehensive. But my school was 30% Asian and 30% black. And when I learned the other day that Sir Nigel Farage enjoyed the fact that his initials were NF, the same as National Front, which was the far-right party at the time, and that a friend of his said that he also enjoyed shouting "gas them all, gas them all" to Jewish students.
I think on that, the accusation there was more that he would. No, you're right. Actually, that was the he would sing it. It was a well-known neo-Nazi song at the time about Jewish people, and then the other accusation in a letter from a former school friend of his that came out, I think, in 2019, before the last election, was that he would sort of sidle up to Jewish students and whisper similarly offensive comments in their ears. And I have to tell you, I actually met someone that was at school with Nigel Farage and was Jewish and told me, I have no way of triple checking it, that was exactly what Farage had done to him during their times at Dulwich College together. But we all did things at school, Ben, that we might repudiate now, didn't we?
Yes, well, we absolutely did. I mean, I found it particularly offensive because at the time the National Front were actually getting out terrorising my black friends outside the school gate. So for me, that brings back a lot of very bad memories. But I think subsequently what he's done is he's the person that led the charge. I don't think, Ken Clarke described him, I think, as the most influential politician of any of this generation.
In the context of Brexit, I think that's probably fair.
I genuinely think that Johnson is as revolting as I find Johnson, and I really do find him revolting. I don't actually think, despite the ridiculous things he said in The Spectator, he's a real racist. I seem to recall in London he actually proposed
an amnesty for illegal immigrants.
Yes, and I think that Johnson. That's my view, anyway.
No, I like it. I think that some of these accusations were put to Farage at the time. He didn't directly respond to them, but he did say there were many people of that time who were attracted to extreme groups on both sides of the debate. And indeed, he referenced some of the historical events you described when he said the period during which I was at Dulwich was highly politically charged with the rise of Thatcherism to the Brixton riots just down the road. I having also attended public school, I'm pretty sure that if these accusations were untrue, there would have been a long queue, and he decided perhaps to take legal action against people who published them. There would have been a long queue of former schoolfellows coming forward to defend him and say that his denials were absolutely fair. But of course, there were no denials. He simply said there were many people so in response to accusations that he used to sing "Gas Them All" about the Holocaust and about Jewish people, his response was there were many people of that time who were attracted to extreme groups on both sides of the debate. So it's 1-0 to Nigel Farage. Eli is, thank you, Ben. Eli's in Oxford. Eli, what would you like to say?
I'd like to say that they're both horrible people.
Well, they agree with you. Well, they don't agree with you, but they agree with you about each other. They agree with you about each other.
No, I just think they're both horrible people. But if we have to really go through what you actually want from a politician, it's Farage, because as bad as it is, I don't agree with much he says, anything he says really, but you want a politician to come in, make a change, be believable, and actually believe in what they say. And I get that from Farage. I don't quite get that from Boris.
This is fascinating. So Ben,
as bad as it is, I don't agree with anything Farage says. And
but this was Ben's point. Ben was making exactly the same point, but jumping the other way, because he was defending Johnson by saying he doesn't really mean it when he comes out with the really disgusting stuff. So I'm going to vote for Farage. You're saying no, Farage really means it when he comes out with the disgusting stuff.
Yeah,
so I'm going to vote for him. So you like your bigotry honest.
Yeah, I'd like if I don't agree with you, I want you to just be honest with me.
Wow.
I just prefer the honesty over, okay, well, it might not be, well, this might happen and this might happen when you know full well that it's not going to happen.
Well, no, but there's different flavours of honesty, because Sadiq Khan, for example, clearly doesn't hate England. And when people like Farage claim that they've got no problem with immigration, they just want people to integrate. You can't get much more integrated than getting elected Mayor of London on 3 successive occasions with record mandates. And so, and then to tweet yesterday that a law about banning cab drivers from flying England flags during a football tournament is proof that Sadiq Khan hates England. That's a racist lie, quite probably. So he's not honest in that sense.
Yeah, but not in that sense. But I mean, with like the whole, I don't agree with the whole Brexit thing, but he actually wanted something to happen, made it happen, and actually believed and semi-stuck with it.
But now claims that that what has happened, or he doesn't like talking about what has happened, or he blames it on everybody else. But this is, so it's 1-1. I get it, but I wasn't expecting the grounds for both votes to be the same. What one of them really means the stuff that he says, and one of them doesn't, and therefore They get 1 vote each, so that is 1-1. Eli, thank you. The phone lines are open. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. Let me start adding some text to the votes just so that we get some higher numbers. Charles says, morning, James. I'd give the edge of repugnance to Nigel on the basis of compassion for the conned. I think he is more cynical and aware of exactly what he's doing than Boris, who is deluded enough to partly believe his own cobblers. So that becomes 2-1. The idea of opting for the honest racist, if that's what you took away from Eli's call, has upset, or rather has entertained, I think, many of you, including Luis, and Edward hearing echoes of the fine people on both sides argument. Let's crack on. Here's another good one from Jeremy. I'll give prizes for the best analogies. Jeremy says it's like being asked to pick your favourite Cray twin. Wes is in Brant Broughton in Lincolnshire. Wes, what would you like to say?
Hi there, first time caller.
Welcome.
Thank you. I can't believe it's that have brought me to the phone. And I'm just listening to the previous calls there, and I think I'm similar. I think after much deliberation since you came through,
yes.
I think Boris pips it for me because
yes.
of the flip-flopping nature of his his personality, and at least, and it's quite painful to say this, but at least Nigel Farage has been clear in his convictions for, the last couple of decades. So yeah, I hate to say it, but I think Boris worse.
Johnson gets the nod 2-2. So we've got this thing emerging now that opportunism is worse than what many people describe as sincere racism. That's quite an odd position to find ourselves in, Wes.
Isn't it just? And, also Boris has held a much higher office and has been in a much grander sphere of influence, although Nigel Farage is extremely influential.
Yes.
And I just think when you're at that level and, when you're dealing with the Queen and things like that, you are deep, you're reaching down into real repugnancy.
I think perhaps what you're describing is the difference between a professional performer and a professional heckler. So, for all his influence over, racial tension and Brexit and the rest of it, he's only ever been a heckler, throwing tomatoes, which is why he somehow managed to disassociate himself from any responsibility whatsoever for Brexit, while simultaneously claiming it as a great achievement. Whereas Johnson ended up in charge. Johnson ended up in the driving seat, albeit with Dominic Cummings sitting on his lap. Controlling the steering wheel while Johnson tried to do the pedals. The bottom line is that sending Jacob Rees-Mogg to Balmoral to lie to the Queen about the prorogation of Parliament. These are scandals that go beyond the media and move into the very heart of our unwritten constitution, you would say.
Yeah. I would say so, but it's a hell of a challenge.
It is a hell of a challenge, which is why things are so tight at what is. Well, I could be half time, although we could, of course, carry on with this for a little bit longer. That is very much in the gift of the contributors. Can we get anyone, do you think, who's got the guts to, as a fan of both, has got the guts to ring in and say now that they're calling each other morally repugnant? Someone who doesn't see it like a choice between constipation and diarrhea, someone who sees it like being asked to choose between daddy and chips or between strawberry and mint choc chip ice cream, two things that you have previously considered to be absolutely delicious, but now you are being called upon to decide which one is right when they call the other one worse than them. They're both essentially saying it's morally repugnant to parrot Kremlin talking points, but he does it more than I do it, or he did it before I did it, or he does it as well. Just don't mention the fact that by my own standards, that makes me morally repugnant too. So who would we put on this list? Who would be prepared to say, I like them both, but I think on this occasion, Farage is more morally repugnant than Johnson, or Johnson is more morally repugnant than Farage. On the questions of honesty, when he was being interviewed about Putin by Nick Robinson on the BBC, did a bang-up job. He also lied, of course, about George Robertson, the former head of NATO. And that was something that George Robertson himself addressed yesterday on Tom Swarbrick's show on LBC. So you can tell sometimes, well, when he says things, if you're a long-time student, and I'm a long-time student of both of them, they both get a chapter, by the way, to themselves in how they broke Britain. As soon as he said that stuff about George Robertson, my little internal sort of sensor, SENSOR, started beeping. I thought, that can't be right. That can't be right. And Tom put that directly to George Robertson yesterday afternoon. We'll have a little listen to what happened after the very latest news headlines with Amelia Cox.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:33 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we find ourselves in uncharted territory today because we agree with both Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. Imagine if you've just tuned in. Now you think, what the hell has happened? How can you agree with those two characters after all the things that you've chronicled, described and explained over the last 10 years? Well, the answer is quite straightforward. They've called each other morally repugnant. So it's a rare outbreak of honesty in both camps, but I'm wondering which one is more deserving of the title. Who, in other words, is more morally repugnant? It's like having to choose the lesser of two weasels. I quite like that from Roddy. But I also want to hear from people who disagree with the idea that they are both weasels or that they are both morally... Well, you can't disagree with the idea that they're both morally repugnant because you have to tell me which one you agree with more. There you go. That's the way to do it. I sounded like Punch and Judy then. Which one do you agree with more? So you agree with both of them about almost everything, but when they call each other morally repugnant, which one do you agree with more? 0345 6060 973. George Robertson, of course, former Secretary General of the Military Alliance, was cited by Farage in that interview with the BBC at the weekend as someone who agreed with him that the invasion of Ukraine was prompted by EU and NATO expansionism, a relatively meaningless phrase, but nonetheless an accusation serious enough for George Robertson to come on Tom Swarbrick's programme on LBC yesterday and address directly.
Well, Nigel Farage suggests that you agree with him on his logic, and he cites an interview that you gave to the New Statesman in which you said, quote, "The whole Ukraine crisis started off with the offer of an EU accession agreement to Ukraine in 2014.
Well, that is right, because the government of Ukraine at that time wanted an association agreement, but were told by the Kremlin that they had to reject it. So it was a decision at that point by Ukraine, and eventually they overthrew the man who rejected because they wanted to be inside the European Union. But it wasn't the European Union foisting itself on Ukraine. It was responding to the desire by the Ukrainians to be inside the European Union. So to claim that I'm supporting Nigel Farage at this point is simply dishonest.
Surely not. Simply dishonest. 2-2 at the moment, although I probably should try and include a few more texts. It's happening again. They're moving too quickly for me to get any sort of handle on them, and I can't just randomly pick texts to add to the tally because that would be deeply unscientific. Francis is in Brixton. Francis, who's it going to be?
Hi, James. Good to speak to you. Long-time caller, first-time listener. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Take your time.
I do speak to the spammer, just so you know, so it might sound a bit strange every now and again.
Sure.
Just so the thing which interests me is that people are saying that Boris Johnson is worse than Nigel Farage because he's an opportunist.
Yes.
For me, though, I take it in the opposite direction, and I say he's not quite so bad as Nigel Farage because he's an opportunist. Yes. Essentially, opportunists only exist and they can only do their thing because another person has opened the door for them to take the opportunity, essentially. And the other thing about being an opportunist, you know how it was looking like Boris Johnson to go 50-50 on whether he supports Remain or leave? Apparently he wrote an essay.
He wrote 2 columns, you're absolutely right. I'd forgotten about that.
Essentially, we could be looking at another version of history where he's still an opportunist, but to jump on the Remain bandwagon to advance himself. He would still be an opportunist, he'd still be one of the most pathetic humans to ever exist, but he would not have ended up driving the country into the ground. And essentially, something I notice is that people often respect people for the strength of their beliefs as opposed to actually the quality of those beliefs. I really don't believe that. I would rather be hanging out with a weak-willed hypocrite who can go in any direction as opposed to somebody who believes absolutely horrible things, advocates for those horrible things. Yes. But you know what? At least they have authenticity. And no, I completely disagree with that. I'm afraid.
It's 3-2 to Farage.
Boris Johnson might be pathetic, but he's not evil.
evil's a pretty hefty accusation to level, but I know that Farage claims to be a great fan and supporter of free speech, so he'll be foursquare behind your right to say that on the radio, even if I think it's perhaps a bit strong.
Sorry.
No, don't. Free speech, mate. They're all for it. They're all for free speech. They never stop. They never stop tweeting about it. Can I ask you some personal advice?
Yeah, please.
Is it patronising of me now to say to you, well done for getting through that so brilliantly, or do I just ignore it and treat you like any other caller, just for future reference?
I've got a bit of a thing. I'm actually very open about my stand. I'm not sensitive. I actually quite like talking about how people ask questions. The one thing I can't stand is when people ask the question, have you done anything to cure or get rid of it?
Yeah. No, I never thought of that.
And essentially, mate, I speak with a stammer, but I do also have a bit of gift of the gab, essentially. So,
You certainly do, and it's a pleasure to listen to you, and I look forward to doing it again.
I really appreciate that. I'm finally going to do the thing that everybody does. I've been listening to you for the past 14, 15 years or something like that.
Good Lord.
No, 10 years, I think.
That's better.
And just thank you for all you do.
God bless you. Thank you, Francis. Nice one. I look forward to you calling in again. I'm moving on only because Natasha Clark has dashed, I think we can say, sprinted into the studio with a look on her face that to me says story breaking.
Breaking news, James. Just in, the Conservatives have pulled their support for Craig Williams and Laura Saunders over that gambling scandal, essentially, that is engulfing the Conservative Party and starting to dominating now this final weeks of this election campaign. Conservative spokespersons just told me, as a result of ongoing internal inquiries, we have concluded that we can no longer support Craig Williams or Laura Saunders as parliamentary candidates at the forthcoming general election. They say, we've checked with the Gambling Commission. This decision does not compromise the investigation that they are conducting, which is rightly independent and ongoing. So days after we got that first Guardian report into Craig Williams, the former aide to the Prime Minister, former Conservative MP, standing again to be re-elected at the next general election. The Conservatives have so far refused to suspend these two candidates, saying essentially that this ongoing investigation means that they can't do so. It seems today that obviously we know there's a rival Tory investigation within the party ongoing into these two, and it sounds like as a result of what they have figured out and find out from their own investigations, they believe that is enough for them to be pulled their support. So that means no Conservatives will be campaigning for them. However, it does, because it is too late to pull them off the ballot paper, mean that their names will still be on that ballot paper on July the 4th.
Confusing, perhaps, for some voters. Even last night they were saying it would not be, quotes, proper, end quotes, to suspend candidates, even as senior Tories lined up. And of course, whoever was on the broadcast round yesterday, Chris Heaton-Harris, I think, tying himself in all sorts of knots, trying to defend Rishi Sunak's position, which Rishi Sunak has 24 hours later completely abandoned.
Rishi Sunak said last night it would be improper to prejudice the results of this ongoing investigation. And obviously we do know that the Gambling Commission's...
Perhaps they got ambushed by a bookie.
Perhaps.
To paraphrase Boris Johnson's defence for breaking, and of course Rishi Sunak's defence for breaking COVID laws. Maybe they were ambushed by a cake. Perhaps these Tories were ambushed by a bookie.
I'll put the question in.
So you go in to vote in these two constituencies, and a full list of candidates will be available at lbc.co.uk/candidates. And you still have name brackets, Conservative close brackets. But and in the unlikely event of them, likely or unlikely, in the event of them winning, they would arrive in Parliament as an independent, I presume.
Again, unclear. It doesn't say that they've, like I say, they're not part of... They can't withdraw the whip from them because they're not official Conservatives in Parliament, so they can't take that away. They're saying they're no longer supporting those two candidates, so they're no longer Conservative candidates. It's a bit like Labour in the Rochdale by-election when they were forced to pull their support for a candidate that made inappropriate remarks. So he was on the ballot paper, but therefore no longer supported by the Labour Party. So yes, I imagine you're probably right, James. They will probably sit as independents in Parliament if they were to be elected.
They were to win. And do you think this is the beginning and the end of this episode of the saga? The saga's not over, as you've mentioned. Various inquiries continuing to unfold. A member of the Metropolitan Police still under arrest, a member of Rishi Sunak's armed guard. Or might this suggest that the Tories know more is coming and are trying to get in front of it. They set a precedent for the next. If other names emerge, they'll be nixed as well.
There's been loads of names swirling around Westminster, none of which have been able to be stood up that they are as part of these ongoing investigations. But there were, Rishi Sunak was forced to deny yesterday. Christine Harris forced to deny yesterday that the cabinet were involved, that there were ministers involved. They said, as far as they know, there is no more names coming. But look, we know that the Gambling Commission has got quite a wide remit at the moment, looking into candidates, those related to the Conservative Party and friends and family of those people that they may have believed.
And finally, Natasha, what was James cleverly saying on this issue just an hour or so ago in this very studio?
Yeah, he was asked about it, said it would be inappropriate to comment on this, like I say, just around an hour or so ago. So that decision clearly being made off air. But yes, James cleverly saying it's inappropriate to suspend these people. And obviously they are waiting to see the results back from the Gambling Commission. But clearly there is obviously more going on. And Craig Williams, it's important to stress, has actually admitted to making this bet. He's already made comments on this. He's already said that he should have realised what it would look. Exactly, he's made a massive error. We do know a little bit more detail about that. We have no comment from Laura Saunders. She made a separate comment through her solicitors and said that she will be challenging the BBC on their reports. But yes, this is clearly a decision that's been taken in the last few minutes by the Conservative Party.
And she, of course, is married to the Conservatives' Director of Campaigns, who's currently on leave. He's taken leave of absence after also being
suspected of placing a bet. Yeah.
Oh, what a tangled web we weave. Thank you, Natasha. It's coming up to 10:45. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. If you're just joining us, some breaking news for you. The two candidates accused of placing bets on the date, the then unannounced date of the general election, have now had their support withdrawn by the Conservative Party leadership after days of claiming that would be inappropriate or not proper and various other obfuscations. The decision has now been taken that they will not go into the general election campaign with the support of the party for which they were originally standing. Craig Williams and Laura Saunders, the candidates concerned. I didn't know. Is there such a thing as saturation point? Where you sort of find yourself contemplating the worst political campaign, the worst general election campaign you can ever remember. And that was about a week ago. It became the worst. I wasn't here for Michael Foot in 1983. I was here, but I wasn't here. I was alive, and I was conscious, and I was, politically engaged up to as much as an 11-year-old can be. But good Lord above. 10:45 is the time. Back to the big political question of the morning after this. Who is more morally repugnant? Or rather, let me phrase it correctly. As Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage describe each other as morally repugnant, who's more accurate? Or, if you prefer, which one's worse?
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:49. I had a few quid on that. I had a few quid on those Conservative candidates losing support of the... No, I'm joking. I didn't. Did anyone? Could you get odds on that? Could you get odds on the Tories withdrawing support within hours of saying that it would not be proper to withdraw support? I don't know. It is 10:49, and I wouldn't have placed a bet on this one. It's all to play for. I think at the moment it's actually 52-48. Although, because I made that statistic up, I can't possibly tell you which way it is 52-48. But we're asking who is, as they accuse each other of being morally repugnant, we're asking who is more morally repugnant, Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage. Robert is in Malmesbury. Robert, what do you reckon?
Hello, James. Well, this is a bit like a penalty shootout.
Yes,
because
it is.
I think I'm about to make it 3-3.
Okay.
The most morally repugnant has got to be Boris Johnson.
Really?
Because for some of the reasons that have been already mentioned. Farage, in a weird kind of way, is authentic to his own values.
Yeah, but what if the values are morally repugnant?
Yeah, well, they are. They are.
Well, then surely the fellow who doesn't really believe it is better than the fellow who does.
No, surely
this is
not.
Fascinating. This is absolutely fascinating.
Well, I think there's a psephological kind of PhD in this.
Yeah, you're probably right.
But surely the person that is venal, self-absorbed, in it for himself, and inflicted, the first Prime Minister to inflict, to use your language, economic harm on an entire population. we were sacrificed on the altar.
But what do you think the other fellow would have done?
Egomaniac.
In the same circumstances, what do you think the other fellow would have done? Well, that doesn't matter, does it? Because you're describing things that actually happened.
Yeah, and I don't think, he in a way, that authenticity of Farage means that hopefully he's never going to get the levers of power.
But, so Jamie makes a point, and he's not making any direct comparisons. He's merely pointing out that Adolf Hitler was authentic.
Yeah.
So you would have found someone pretending to be a Nazi worse than Adolf Hitler.
On the basis of a short head, yes, because
by a short head you mean a small margin.
A small margin.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I never.
And he just look at his track record. Everything that he did kind of turned bad.
So this is, I mean, the way I mediate this, and possibly step back from that idea that, as Louise puts it, an honest racist is better than a dishonest racist, which is what Louise is hearing. That's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
The way I mediate it is that distinction between the heckler and the performer.
Correct.
And we don't know what would have happened. Well, we have a vague idea of what happens when the heckler gets onto the main stage. He says things like he said about Vladimir Putin and Ukraine, but not in terms of ever having his hands on the steering wheel, ever having his ever controlling things. And so Johnson then becomes worse because of things he's done, regardless of what they both think.
Yeah. And there is a little bit of bias, I guess, in what I've said, because I have read your book, so I read the chapter.
Okay, well, no, I mean, it's not a prerequisite, but I mean, a statement of the bleeding obvious, I have also read the book that you refer to, possibly a little bit more closely than you, and I struggle. I certainly wouldn't come down on the side that authentic awfulness is better than inauthentic awfulness. I could make a strong case for it being the other way around, but the charge sheet...
conversation is so fascinating.
It is, isn't it? The charge sheet for Johnson is longer, I think it comes down to.
I think that's what I'm saying.
I think that's what you're saying as well. Thank you, Robert. 10:53 is the time. Book got a little appearance on that John Oliver monologue that's gone massively viral from the American late night TV show. I don't think he mentioned me. The book cover just appeared behind him on the screen, which is one of those moments where you genuinely just go, what has happened to my life? This is just amazing. But as ever, good for business, bad for the soul. Alan is in Manchester. Alan, 3-3.
Morning, James. You all right, mate?
Yeah, I'm good, Alan. What's on your mind?
James, when I rang in and speaking to your producer, I genuinely couldn't call this one.
Yeah.
But honestly, I was going to say something then. I dislike both of them intensely, but I have got a VAR.
Oh, wow. Okay, so this is live. This is live decision-making.
Yeah, I've got the VAR, and I'm going to go for Johnson.
4-3.
And there are two reasons. The first is personal, because during COVID, I lost my mum.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And this is a woman, 98-year-old, who built Lancaster bombers during the war in Manchester at Avrose.
Yeah.
And she said to me, she said, listen, son, with this COVID, we've got to do what Mr. Churchill said. We've got to all pull together and we've got to work together. And so while, the vast majority of the country were going out once a day, exercise, we're doing everything by the book, Johnson was partying, and then he lied to Parliament. So this is the other reason, James.
Yeah.
The damage Johnson did, he did in Parliament. Farage, as an MEP, never got into the Euro Parliament. He had the worst attendance record of, I think, any MEP.
That's outrageous. It was the second worst.
Sorry, James. even VAR, you can even VAR can't be perfect sometimes.
I think it was the second one.
I think it was the second. Yeah. So I know. I believe allegedly he never got past the bar with the rest of his UKIP goons.
Certainly did nothing for fishermen, because he was on the committee.
They were thrown under the big red bus, the fishermen and the farmers by Farage.
Yes.
And the thing is. And the other thing about Farage is... You're not
talking yourself back round again, are you, Alan?
No, I've made the decision.
You've
because
made your
I know
vote.
you pushed me for a decision, James. But also, with regarding Johnson, it shouldn't be forgot that 2 days after there was a NATO summit to discuss the Salisbury poisonings.
Yes.
And that was the second time that Putin had launched a chemical attack on this country.
Yes.
Johnson ended up in Italy at Alexander Ledbedev's castle. He was an ex-KGB colonel, and there's some great work been done by John Sweeney.
You're not wrong.
And he went there without his diplomatic protection unit.
We still don't know what happened. We just know that he was in something of a state when photographed at the airport by a member of the public making his way back from that bender.
Yes, exactly. And I hope that if Kay gets in, we can investigate this, because, it's like, I believe the KGB is like the mafia. You might say you retire, but you never actually retire.
Well, oddly enough,
no one went on at that meeting.
Vladimir Putin agrees with you about that. I mean, it was a party, but there was a meeting. That didn't emerge for a very long time until afterwards. And if the Labour Party does decide to launch a campaign, then the journalist Carol Cadwallader will have done a proper investigation, will have done an awful lot of work for them. The Russia report, of course, which was kept out of the public eye for a very long time, concluded that we can't say whether there was Russian intervention, Russian interference in the Brexit vote, because we haven't actually investigated whether there was any Russian interference in the Brexit vote.
James, I believe there was... When he had the press interview, I know Kevin, the Labour MP, was on that committee, and I think, was it Julian Smith or Lewis? He's a sort of very independent-minded Tory defence, and there was an SNP guy, and they asked him about that, and he turned, and I remember his face, he said, yes, we were never asked to investigate Russian interference in elections. So yes. I hope that we do investigate Russian interference in elections.
And these are all reasons why you've after a VAR, you've gone for Boris Johnson, which makes it 4-3, and that there is a bit of a pattern emerging in that the Farage votes seem to hinge upon the idea that his moral repugnance is authentic, whereas Boris Johnson's moral repugnance is opportunistic. That seems to have informed a lot of the Farage votes, whereas the Johnson votes seem to hinge upon things actually done as opposed to views actually expressed. It's not a 100% analysis of where the votes have gone, but it is nonetheless I think an interesting one. And I'd refer you back. I'd return to that observation about the inability of London black cabs to display England flags, a decision taken when Boris Johnson was Mayor of London. Farage tweeting yesterday that it's proof that that Sadiq Khan hates England. And if you want to know who he is appealing to, then have a look at how those sort of lies get picked up by social media, on social media, and now, of course, by the so-called news outlets that are bankrolled to enormous losses of millions upon millions of pounds, so that people like Farage can have their own TV shows. 4-3 to Johnson. It's all to play for. I think we may take a few more votes on this as things stand. We may not. You'll have to stay tuned to find out. The number you need if you want to join in. We haven't had anybody. I'm not going to lie to you, I wasn't expecting an avalanche of people who are members of both fan clubs, both the Boris Johnson fan club and the Nigel Farage fan club, prepared to actually pick a side on a day like today, prepared to tell me who they agree with more when they describe the other one as morally repugnant. It is like that Spider-Man meme that I mentioned yesterday, when you've got two Spider-Men, if that's the technical term. Is it Spider-Men or Spider-Mans? You've got two Spider-Men pointing at each other, going, wait, but it's you. No, you're morally repugnant, says Nigel Farage. No, you're morally repugnant, says Boris Johnson. And many of us sit there going, oh, wow, you're both right.
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. History will judge them differently, writes Peter. Johnson will be remembered as a PM who drove a JCB through standards in public life and ruined the country by, quotes, getting Brexit done, end quotes. Farage will be remembered as a populist chancer whose main contribution to our political history was to awaken the far right and bring racism and xenophobia into the mainstream. It's a dead heat. quite a few people finding it impossible to choose between the two. Oh, James, I'm loving this hour. Categorically, no doubt about it. Boris was far worse for all the reasons your very astute listeners have articulated. Versus from Graham. Hi, James, long-time listener, first-time WhatsApper. I think Farage wins the most repugnant person award because I think Johnson has an easily identifiable, albeit publicly undiagnosed, antisocial personality disorder that clearly includes compulsive lying to feed his enormous ego and advance his personal wealth/self-worth. He can't stop himself from doing it, whereas Farage arguably chooses to adopt his positions, to tell lies, to advance his personal/political aims/wealth/social standing. That makes more sense to me as an impartial observer. It makes more sense to me that you would vote for Farage because he has a choice in the matter. There's others describing it as authenticity, whereas Johnson, you could argue, couldn't lie straight in bed. And that then long list of people that he's lied to over the years makes it possible that he has no control over these kind of impulses. But the texter who suggested that he had revivified xenophobia and the far right in this country when casting his vote for a dead heat would be perhaps interested. Which well-known... I don't know. I think he calls himself a journalist at the moment. Who do you think's just been arrested in... If I told you that somebody who has an awful lot to say about immigration had just been arrested in Canada on immigration offences, who's the funniest person that could be? During an election campaign, during a period of British politics where script writers would send it back, script editors would send it back to script writers and say, this is far too implausible, don't be ridiculous, write me something that is at least vaguely credible. Which prominent immigration loudmouth being arrested, who would be the funniest person that could be arrested today in Canada on immigration offences? And you're only allowed to enter this if you genuinely don't know the answer. If you genuinely don't know the answer, then you can get in touch. I've got a couple of unhinged headlines in contention for you today. We're sort of going back through the archives now that it's proved so popular to find ones that we missed at the time, but some of them are so good that they can't be left to languish in a filing cabinet somewhere. But we've also got an idiot's corner. This is from Andy. Andy writes, "Hi James, you need to get over the inferiority complex you have with Johnson and Farage. It's getting slightly embarrassing and very boring." So Andy's a good example of someone who loves them both and is sort of, at the moment, the brain can't engage with the matter. But I love them both. But they're calling each other morally repugnant. I know what I'll do. I'll send some abuse to James. That's what I'll do. So that is, I suppose, honest in the sense that if you're asked to choose between two morally repugnant people who are calling each other morally repugnant, but you're still a little bit in love with both of them, that perhaps is where you end up. Quite a few correct guesses coming in. A couple of incorrect. No, it's not Noel Edmonds who's been... I mean, to be fair, that would be very funny, but I don't think he could ever be described as a prominent voice in often dishonest conversations about immigration. 7 minutes after 11 is the time. Back to the votes. 4-3 to Boris Johnson at the moment as they accuse each other of being morally repugnant. Who gets your vote? Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage? Harriet's in Clapham. Harriet, what do you think?
Hi, James. It's a vote for Farage.
Okay, 4-4. God, this is getting very tight. This is a nail biter, this squeaky bum time. Tell me why.
Well, I think, and your previous callers have said a lot about authenticity when they were trying to argue the opposite.
Yes.
And I think that Farage lacks authenticity, lacks honesty, all of that stuff. And I think people just maybe don't realise because he's possibly a better liar. Okay. And the example I wanted to...
A better liar than Boris Johnson?
Exactly, which is in itself incredible. But the example I wanted to call out was when he was on I'm a Celeb, which I didn't watch the whole thing, but I did watch this sort of clip of it.
Yeah.
And he's essentially having a debate or a discussion with Nella Rose, who's a black woman.
Yes.
She's a YouTuber, I think. And they're talking about blackface, and she's explaining why that's offensive to people and why that's wrong. Not just blackface, I think it's broader things like that, like maybe cultural appropriation.
Yes.
And she's explaining how hurtful it is and why it's wrong. And he kind of does this thing where he shakes his head and he goes, "Oh, I don't know what the rules are anymore." And he's kind of playing this act of somebody who's maybe just a bit out of touch, and the world is changing really fast and he just can't keep up, and he's trying, but it's so confusing. And when I saw that, I was like, wow, he's just a better liar, because his whole, all of the lies, I think, are in service of his beliefs. And beliefs and values, I kind of see them in the same way.
So I'm not familiar with the episode either that you described. But what I know from the past is that when he's accused of racism, he often replies by saying, "Well, what is racism?" And you sort of think, well, you can't be sure you're not something if you don't know what it is. So you're doing that thing, or you can't say. I think possibly were other people using Jamaican accents in a sort of musical interlude or something like that, and he tried to claim that would be just as offensive as using blackface, and Nella Rose tried to explain context, tried to explain that the decision or the judgment on whether or not something is offensive has a lot to do with the intent behind the behaviour, the context in which the behaviour takes place. See, this is where he's at his weirdest, I think, in that you can sort of see the frustrated 13-year-old there who just can't ever accept that they're wrong about anything. It's a sort of no nonsense. You can't say this. You can't say that. You can't do this. You can't do that. Even to the point where he ends up trying to lecture a black woman on what cultural appropriation is or isn't, and the victimhood. Exactly. If I did something like that, I'd get a backlash. Okay, yeah, it's an interesting example, and it speaks to a different interpretation of what authenticity means in this context, and it means the score is now level at 4-all, 52-48, 0345 60 6060973. Thank you, Harriet. James is in Sheffield. James, it's 4-4, and I haven't decided when it's going to end yet, but it's highly likely it's going to end on a draw. Go on.
Well, I'm tipping it Farage's way.
Okay, 5-4 then. 5-4. A late surge for Farage. Go on.
Yeah. So interesting. The last few calls, it turned from the initial calls from Farage being authentic as a better thing than Johnson. Yes. I see it the way the last couple of callers have, where the authenticity of him is actually what makes him a lot worse.
Yes.
I was explaining to your producer, I actually think Johnson, as terrible as he is, if he had the opportunity, after lining his own pockets and looking after himself, to actually really do well for the country, I feel like he would have done, and he would have enjoyed that.
If he thought the passage into Downing Street would be eased by him being the biggest Remainer in the country, he'd have been the biggest Remainer in the country. And if he thought that it would play well with his audience to introduce an amnesty for illegal immigrants, or to talk up about the benefits of multiculturalism and the brilliance of having mayors from ethnic minorities, he'd have done all of that if he thought it would have got him more power or money. All of it.
Absolutely. And he'd have revelled in it. You know, the hero status, the ego, he'd have loved that. Farage, it's much darker for me. He's got an ideology that he drives. And, you know, when you look back to the Brexit thing, actually now, especially with hindsight, you can see how much he knows what he's telling you isn't true.
Yeah.
And it's a different kind of dishonesty to Johnson's. And he's just terrible, by the way. I hate this because it's funny. I start describing Farage, and I feel like I'm being nice to Johnson.
I know, mate. That's why it's such a genius bit of radio production, this.
Yeah, I'll give you that.
We all feel soiled because you've got to. The only people who can't pick a side are people like our friend Andy, who's decided to have a swing at me instead. Because if you actually think they're both great, today is your worst nightmare. Today is the day when you realise, well, hang on, if they think if they both think the other one is morally repugnant, maybe they are both morally repugnant. And I've not only set my stall out in support of them both over the years, I've cast my votes.
Impossible, James. It's all your fault, mate.
I know. But you've given it 4. So 5-4. 5-4 to Farage because of the opposite of that authenticity argument that we have heard a little earlier. Thank you, James. Richard is in Freising in Germany. Richard, for the international contribution, what does the Freising jury have to say about this?
Johnson.
Oh, for heaven's sake, that's 5-all again. This is just unbelievable. It is a never-ending penalty shootout. Go on, then.
Are you going to stop it when it's 52-48?
If I could, I would, but it's only 5-all. We'll be here until this time tomorrow if we get into those sort of numbers.
I'm going for Johnson because we've always had right-wing figures on the fringe. Think about Martin Webster and Nick Griffin.
Yes.
They were more guarded than Farage in what they said.
Or less adroit, you might say.
Yeah. And I'm going for Johnson because I think it was his duty as a politician in one of our mainstream parties to call Farage out for what he is, instead of sidling up to him and trying to sneak up a bit of the support that he gained.
I think the clincher will be that we can't know. We can only suspect what Farage would have done in high office, whereas we know what Johnson had done in high office, and therefore he gets the nod from you.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, for everything else Johnson did, obviously that's a factor. But if you think back when I think David Cameron was still opposition leader and he called out UKIP as...
Here, actually, it was with Nick. I can't remember what he said. Fruitcakes, liars and racists, was it?
Hang on, fruitcakes, closet racists and loons.
That's it. If only he'd stuck to his guns, If only he'd stuck to his guns.
Cameron is still calling out Farage for what he said about Sunak not sharing our values.
God, yeah, of course.
Yeah. And Johnson's got into this spat with Farage, and it's not about, xenophobia or anything like that. It is Ukraine, which is the only call that Johnson arguably got right during his time in office.
Although Farage is right, this is what James was talking, Richard in Sheffield was talking about a minute ago. Every twist of this conversation involves you defending someone that you consider to be largely indefensible. But Farage was right when he reminded us that during the Brexit debate, when they were on the same side, Johnson did come out and try to blame the EU explicitly for the invasion of Crimea in 2012.
Yeah. Probably when Putin invaded Ukraine, Johnson had 2 speeches lined up.
I think that's more than... And we're back to opportunism on his part. So 5-5 is the time at 11:15. Just on the question of why people won't ring me if they are fully paid up members of both fan clubs. David Frum, the American diplomat, said something quite brilliant on a podcast the other day called the Bulwark Podcast, Bulwark. For anyone sniggering at the back. This is brilliant. And this, in many ways, is it couldn't be more pertinent to some of the points that we've made in the course of this morning. He said, you can warn your friend that he is being conned, and he will get angry at you. And when the whole thing comes crashing down, and he loses his money, and he can no longer deny that you were right, he will never forgive you. He will forgive the crook, but he will not forgive the people who warned him about the crook. The crook just took his money, but you made him feel dumb. And that, somewhat contradictorily, is why the catchphrase compassion for the conned, contempt for the conmen exists. But it's also why Idiot's Corner exists, because I am your friend, and I did warn you that you were being conned. And you did get angry at me, and the whole thing has come crashing down, and you have lost your money or your Brexit or your dreams, and you can no longer deny that I was right, but you will never forgive me. You will forgive the crook, but you will not forgive the people who warned you about the crook, because the crook just took your money or your votes or your dreams. We made you feel dumb. And it doesn't matter how many times I tell you that I don't think you're dumb, you'll never forgive me for making you feel that way. It's 11:17.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 11:18, and I mean, I get the casting vote now because we've got to crack on. There's something else I want to talk to you about, but I can't do it. I think I'm probably going to get political paranoia. Eleanor's got a slightly terrified look on her face. I can't. Am I not allowed to make the casting vote? No. Okay. I won't then. 52-48. Would that be allowed? I don't know. So I shall leave it hanging. 5-5. 5 votes for Farage, 5 votes for Johnson. God knows how many hundreds of votes on the WhatsApps and texts, but we don't have the resources to count them. I shall leave it there. Who is more morally repugnant? It's a dead heat. It's not even 52-48. It is completely equal, but some brilliant explanations and some brilliant combinations, if you like. Now, I want to move on now to something completely different, and you may want to, Stuart, last word to Stuart. He goes, it's definitely Boris Johnson. I've seen him play tennis, which is a very in comment, one of my obsessions about that whole horrible period of British history when we had such utterly and signally inadequate people in charge of our national response to something as catastrophic as as COVID-19, as an imminent fatal pandemic. One of my absolute obsessions with it is the kind of education that I received and that Boris Johnson and David Cameron received, designed essentially to create soldiers of empire, to create men who could go off to the other side of the world and take over without questioning their entitlement to do so or their right to do so, or having any form of emotional literacy that may have made them more empathetic to the people they were exploiting and oppressing, or indeed to the fundamental injustice of what they were doing. So public schools in Britain, certainly until the 80s or 90s, used to create precisely those sort of men, and having them in charge when the pandemic arrived was absolutely disastrous. And the point at which the scale of how disastrous it was came when David Cameron said Boris Johnson caught COVID, and David Cameron said, "Don't worry, he'll be fine. I've seen him play tennis." And I thought, if you didn't go to a school like mine, you probably think that's the maddest thing you've ever heard. And even if you did, it remains among the maddest things you've ever heard. But we know why it happened. 21 minutes after 11 is the time. I want you to tell me now how worried I should be about physician associates. There's probably, if you've got any connection whatsoever to this story, there's probably someone that you want to get on the phone to immediately. I can't remember the last time an important public debate unfolded, largely on social media, but it's now moved into the legal world, where I didn't fully understand or even have the first understanding of what the debate was about. So there is an increasing use of people called physician associates in the NHS. These are people who have not had as much training as doctors. In fact, they don't have formal medical training, but they will, I think, have some science-based degrees. Increasingly, I am told, they are moving into roles where patients or NHS users may not be fully aware of what is happening, up to and including concerns that some PAs or physician associates are being drafted into GP surgeries to replace family doctors. The BMA and several royal colleges have called for a recruitment freeze on physician associates while concerns are addressed. The British Medical Association is taking the medical regulator to court over the increasing use of physician associates. They are being used increasingly in order to ease the pressure on the NHS. I suppose the worst case scenario is the argument that they're bringing in people to ease the pressure on the NHS who are simply not qualified or fit for purpose in the jobs that they will be doing to ease the pressure on the NHS. But it's the urgency of easing the pressure on the NHS that has lowered the bar to an unacceptable level. And then the other extreme of this argument would be there's absolutely nothing to worry about. You don't need to have spent 5 years at medical school to do a large proportion of the work that qualified doctors are called upon to do. We also have anaesthetist. That's one of those words, isn't it? Have you got an anaesthetist? Even if I speak a bit of Greek, I should be able to get my chops around a word like that really easily. Anaesthetist associates, anaesthetist associates, anaesthetist associates, anaesthetist associates, and physician associates, PAs and AAs. The British Medical Association argues that the uncontrolled experiment of using them more will lead to more unintended patient harm. There's a grim case of a 30-year-old woman called Emily Chesterton who was twice misdiagnosed by a physician associate as having an ankle sprain when what she actually had was a blood clot that subsequently travelled from her leg to her lung, and Emily sadly died. She was under the impression throughout this process that she was being seen by a GP. So who is qualified to contribute to this conversation? I mean, I can obviously say some people who are, doctors are, physician associates are. Who's qualified to adjudicate? I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea who is qualified to adjudicate. So what I want to do is really just a crash course. Why are you comfortable or uncomfortable with the increasing use of physician and anaesthetist associates within the NHS? 0345 6060 973. I also need a history lesson. I mean, is it the case that... Because they could both be right. So this could be a lowering of the qualifications bar to bring people into the NHS where pressure is acute. But it could also be that there's nothing to worry about, because the qualifications that you need to undertake a lot of the roles that physician and anaesthetist associates will be undertaking are actually lower than the threshold to become a normal doctor, a normal GP, a normal physician, or a normal anaesthetist. So I honestly don't know. I mean, a little bit of me thinks if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I would lean towards a form of, well, hang on a minute. I mean, I've never really I've never found myself in a medical situation and found myself thinking this doctor seems a bit overqualified. I've never taken the kids to A&E and thought, I mean, I don't really care whether they've been to medical school or not, but that's probably me being ignorant or naive. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. How worried should we be by the rise of the physician associate? And I think in the first instance, answers are probably going to come, although I'm not laying down any laws or rules on this, are probably going to come from people within the NHS. I wonder whether nurses would be the best people to talk to. Nurses who work with both might be able to give us a quick heads up on how worried we should be. The debate is febrile now. The debate has become vicious to the point where the Doctors' Union is now taking the medical regulator to court over this, claiming that it makes patients unsafe at worst, and at best it creates a dangerous blurring of lines for patients. This is in preparation for December of this year, when the General Medical Council would become the regulator for physician associates and anaesthetist associates, as well as more traditional professionals. Is that the correct word to use, the correct phrase to use? Because then I read that PAs and AAs have not been regulated at all for 2 decades, at which point I wonder why I'm being told to start worrying about it now. But when Professor Bamfield told the British Medical Association annual conference that he was planning to sue the General Medical Council, I can tell you that he was cheered and applauded by his membership. So what is going on? What do you know? 0345 6060 973. And how worried should the rest of us be? I'd also add, just by way of an aside, a sort of anecdotal aside, I'd also add that, and I'm thinking of my mum here, I won't lie to you, and she won't mind. The older people get, I find, the easier it is for them to have their trust in the health service undermined. They get scared, don't they? Or they get worried that they're being glossed over, or that the doctor's too busy to give them the care and the attention that they need. And that cuts both ways on this. You strike up a relationship with a physician associate that you trust and who looks after you well. It's not as if these people are going to go into it for clicks and giggles. That then easing the pressure on the NHS could really help. But on the other hand, the fear that somebody listening to this now, for the first time learning about the full extent of it, the fear that then when they go to the doctor, they might think they're seeing a GP, but they're actually seeing a physician associate, will make them deeply concerned. And I suppose I should, in the interest of full disclosure, the voices I trust most in the NHS space have been largely, if not unanimously, either negative or sceptical about the rise of the PA and the AA. And that doesn't mean they're right, but it does mean that even subconsciously I'll be coming perhaps to this conversation with bias. I mention that because the advocate for the physician associate, the advocate for the anaesthetist associate may be hesitating to ring in And I'm just reminding you that you really need to. So what's going on, and how worried should we be? And remember, you're allowed to answer not worried at all to that question. That's kind of the point. 11:30 is the time. After the headlines, I will reveal to you which prominent immigration loudmouth has just been arrested in Canada on or suspicion of immigration offences. No prizes for this one. About 85 to 90% of you guessed it correctly. And some of the incorrect guesses veered from the sublime to the ridiculous. But I will share only the correct answer to which prominent anti-immigration loudmouth has been arrested in British, I should add, has been arrested in Canada this morning on suspected immigration offence. You couldn't make it up, could you? It is 11:30. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Trolled by my own newsreader now. So I'd spend ages building up some tension on a what we call in the trade a hook and tease. Not my strongest suit, I grant you. Historically, not the element of the radio presenting lark that I acquit myself most efficiently at. But I get one right. I build it up beautifully. Which immigration loudmouth has been arrested? British immigration loudmouth has been arrested in Canada on immigration charges, and Amelia Cox drops it in the middle of a bloody news bulletin, sucking all the joy, sucking the marrow out of the bone of my hook and tease. But anyway, that is indeed the answer. Little Tommy 10 names, or Stephen Yaxley Lennon, or Stephen Lennon, or Tommy Robinson, or whatever he's calling himself this week. I wonder what the name is on his passport. Unfortunately, we can't check with him because it's just been confiscated. That is the fact. It's not the first time he's been arrested on immigration charges either. But I think for the far right, irony died a very, very, very long time ago. Canada, of course, I suppose, in the business of controlling their borders. But that story there for people who think that satirists have got it easy. 11:34 is the time. Radio presenters haven't got it easy. Not when you turn your attention to a subject that is clearly desperately important and is exciting enormous emotion in the medical profession, which means we should all care about it, but which is a little bit difficult to get a handle on, not least because the opposing lobbies are both equally passionate, equally committed. So, physician associates and anaesthetist associates, what is the story? What is going on? And should we, the patients, be worried? Nisha is in Haringey to start us off. Nisha, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello, Nisha.
I'm, second time on LBC, and I'm trying to be a non-emotional medic about this, actually.
Well, you're allowed to be emotional, but I understand your point. No, I do. It's important.
Just because it's hard to get people to understand stuff when you speak with emotion is the problem. I do feel quite emotional about it because I'm a retiring psychiatrist.
Okay.
I, therefore, have a lot of experience in mental health, but I also did do membership exams with the Royal College of Physicians. I'm actually physically trained as well, and lots of people don't realise that psychiatrists are doctors first, as in physical health doctors first, and then they become mental health doctors after more training, right? So I'm a doctor. And I, because I'm at the end of my career, have worked with a lot of different health professionals, many of which, such as some of the specialist nurses I've worked with, are heaps better than a newly qualified junior doctor because they've got more years under their belt and they're cleverer and they're kinder and they get it, right?
Okay.
And you get really, really poor quality doctors who are young and who went into medicine perhaps because they really like maths and they need to be an anaesthetist putting people to sleep rather than a psychiatrist talking to people.
Right.
So doctors are a great variety of people and physician associates are a great variety of people. But the big difference is that the doctors have done a long training, 5 or 6 years, during which the life experience they've had changes the way that they look after the patient. So no matter how clever they are scientifically, holding somebody's hand while they die or actually being part of, an unsuccessful resuscitation changes what you know about life and death and actually changes the way you access the science in the heat of the moment.
Right, yes, okay.
So, I've got a partner who's mental health professional but went to the same school as you, so it's quite a funny thing. Whenever I listen to you, I think about that.
Gosh.
And he wasn't there for long. And you might remember who he is, but I'm not going to say his name.
Tell the producer afterwards, because you've pricked my interest now.
Okay. Anyway, so as a result of you saying some pretty intelligent things about the private school system, which I think is problematic, I think private medicine is also problematic. But what I also think is that the NHS is broken. And the other reason I came on the radio the other day was to say that. And I got too emotional about it and wasn't very useful to whoever it was I was talking to.
Okay. I'm sure they'd be delighted that they proved so memorable as a presenter. But
they were standing in for somebody, so it's okay.
Let me steer you back, if I may. So there is a need for original thinking here. There is a need for things that have not happened much before. I understand exactly what you say about the maturing of one's medical gifts with experience, but so far I don't, and I know the difference in qualification. So an anaesthetist might already be lacking in the kind of emotional literacy that you're describing, because you describe them as being interested in maths, whereas a practitioner, we would presume, had more intent in bedside manner. But I haven't got much of a handle on how worried I should be about associates at this point.
It depends on what they're being asked to do.
Yes.
And it depends on what they're being sold as to the general public. So look, if you go into A&E with a broken bone, and you see a specialist nurse, actually, I'm going to tell you a personal story. I had a colonoscopy because I was on a 2-week, whatever, that cancer weight thing. Yeah. And the nurse specialist who consented me for the operation and did the procedure was one of the best clinicians I have ever had the benefit of the experience of. He was fantastic. And I believe he was better than any doctor would have been, because he loved what he did. He was so enthusiastic. He consented me properly. He did the procedure. He was just great. Now, if a physician associate is doing something a bit like that, where they are highly skilled to do a particular thing and they do it really well, great. If you're in a GP surgery and you need somebody who can untangle your anxiety from your physical symptoms, who can decide that you are the 1 in 10,000 patients whose tummy ache means it's an aneurysm, not a tummy ache, as another cause. Yes. And who can cope with the coroner's inquest when they miss that aneurysm and that patient dies, then, do you see what I mean?
Well, up to a point I do, but you're making it murkier. And I'm grateful for your efforts, but I mean, obviously, if they're really good at it and they don't mess up, it's not a problem. And if they're not really good at it and they do mess up, then it is a problem. But what can the NHS do? So, for example, if my mum goes to the GPs and she's not seeing an actual GP, A, she has a right to know that, and B, it may not matter, but she will think it does matter and she'll want to see a GP. So how can the NHS introduce this or extend this further without undermining the confidence of patients because of the worry that you're not a proper doctor, that you're not seeing a proper doctor?
That's absolutely right. And I think what happens is, well, firstly, it's all about transparency.
Yeah, but because I don't think it is, because even if you are transparent, if you say, I'm a physician associate, the more familiar we become with the phrase, the more likely it is that we'll acknowledge what that means. And once you know that it means, you'll know that it means, in my language, you're not a proper doctor, you're not a fully qualified doctor. Therefore, I am less likely to want to see you, which means that the physician associate is less likely to be able to alleviate the pressure on the NHS.
No, look, what you can do, actually, you're making me think on my feet, which is really brilliant.
Okay.
What can happen in your mum's situation, I work best with, straightforward examples, is that the physician associate says, hello, I'm a physician associate called X. I'm going to take your blood tests and ask you a couple of questions, and then you're going to see a doctor for the things that
But a lot of people aren't seeing a doctor at all, are they? A lot of people are only seeing the physician associate. What about an anaesthetist associate? Would they be doing the role of an anaesthetist?
So you see, in other countries in Europe, this is why it's not a clear-cut question, which is why...
Well, you're supposed to be making it clear-cut.
Nope. I'm supposed to be explaining clearly why some things don't have a right or wrong, yes or no answer.
No, I get that. I do get that, Nisha. Thank you. And don't forget to give that name to the producer. I know they haven't got a right or wrong answer, but there is a substantive answer to the question of well, maybe it isn't whether we should be worried, but in what circumstances should we be worried? And then you can work to establish the kind of circumstances in which you shouldn't be worried. And then the other problem becomes whether or not this is stopping doctors from training and getting jobs. And another problem becomes, why am I reading about GPs who are working as delivery drivers because they can't get work as locums? There's so much going on here that the more we talk about it, I wonder whether the more confused we get. Ailey is in Belfast. Ailey, what would you like to say?
Hi, so I'm a doctor, I'm an F1, and I actually became aware of this issue a few years ago because I did graduate entry medicine, so I did a degree beforehand. I could have gone and been a PA or I could have been a doctor. And I was like, why am I starting on £29,000?
Yes.
It's now £32,000, but at the time £29,000, and they're starting on £41,000.
What, physician associates are coming in on £41,000?
Yeah, so they were coming in as band 6, but they're now coming in as band 7. So I started looking into this, and I was like, what is the incentive? Why is that happening?
Yes.
And I started looking into the course a bit more, and lots of my friends were physician associates at the same uni.
Right.
And they were saying to me, well, we're doing 5 years of medicine in 2. And I said, hang on, I'm doing 5 years of medicine in 4.
Yeah.
And so how does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I started looking into it, and essentially the reason you should be worried about physician associates is twofold. One is a bit more tinfoil hat, one isn't.
Okay.
The less tinfoil hat one is the way their curriculum works is there is no requirement on a national level, none, for physiology, pharmacology. They purely learn conditions, but they only learn some conditions, and they only learn each condition in certain depth. It is very hard to diagnose someone with something if you don't know what it's not.
Yeah.
How can you say what it is? And so that's a less tinfoil hat worry.
Okay.
That's facts. My bigger worry is not talking about GPs that are already qualified, but ones wanting to get into training. There was something like 10,000 eligible applicants wanting to become GPs this year. They were all rejected because training is not increasing, but the GP practices are paid money by the government to the salary of physician associates, so they can get physician associates for free. And junior doctors' positions to train and become a fully qualified GP is capped.
Why?
So this is where I will get slightly more tinfoil hat. And I genuinely think that they are slowly trying to replace doctors and have much more...
I don't know that this is tinfoil hat, because this fits the facts as you've described them. So there's and who's they, first of all?
Well, good question. It's part of the NHS long-term plan. But I have spent.
Doctors get too much training. The subtext to this somewhere is that doctors get too much training,
or that our training is incredibly inefficient. In which case, fix it. If you can say that these people are equivalent to us, and they are using them in hospitals, including my hospital, as equivalents. If that's true, then why are we doing this training? Why are we being thrown around the country? So physician associates often say to me, I'm a physician associate because I wanted to be able to move between any speciality.
Right.
But a physician associate can work in orthopedics for 10 years and then go and work in GP the next week. A doctor can't do that. They have to retrain all over again.
I'm even more confused. In a good way. I'm more informed. Do you think the more informed I get, the more confused I'm going to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think you would be absolutely terrified if you'd seen all the documents I have. So I've spent literally probably 3 years constantly looking at this because I'm seriously concerned. Initially, I got told that I was being unkind, and now actually it's really backed by a union, because obviously the GMC are going to regulate PAs soon. Which is even more confusing. And actually the GMC, the BMA are looking to take the GMC, they're taking legal action over it now. That was announced the other day over this specific issue.
Yes, I know.
So I've looked extensively into this, and I've seen some really worrying patterns.
Could they be teething troubles? And I don't mean that glibly. I mean,
no. I think that a lot of this is down to trying to save money at their level, and so there's no national scope, and trust can manipulate things how they want to. So, for example, I constantly see a pattern of locum doctors, which are obviously very expensive, being replaced by PAs.
And that's why locum doctors are unemployed now, because there's another story around this week about locum doctors not being able to find work.
Yeah, and
they're fully trained. So a practice owner is making a decision to. So because you started off by saying they were paid more money than you.
Well, then an F1. So I obviously you start doing rotational training as an F1. So,
yes.
I started on 29,000, and they can't prescribe or order scans. So they're coming to me, being paid more money than me, asking me to prescribe for them.
Like I said, the more informed I get, the more confused I get. Are you at the annual general meeting now?
I am, yeah.
Because you got an Irish name, so I thought you might be from Belfast anyway. And then I noticed that the annual general meeting is in Belfast. How many doctors would I find at the same level as you, other F1s, who would say to me, and this is entirely anecdotal, but I'm curious anyway, who'd say, "Oh no, Ailey's just gone mad. Everything's going to be fine." Does that lobby exist?
No, it's vanishingly small. So it did exist 3-4 years ago. So they've amped up the PO role massively. But I think the main concern actually between my colleagues at the moment is just logically, if you've replaced a locum doctor on a ward with a PA, you've got a PA then on the ward. They can't prescribe or order scans. So you're going to have to get another doctor to come onto the ward to do those jobs, which means they're taken away from their training. So I've seen it where the doctors are being taken away from clinics, for example, to come and do ward jobs. And then they say, well, now the PA's got nothing to do. And the PA goes to the clinics.
Oh, Lord. Okay, so
we're missing out.
No, okay, final question. Thank you. This is helpful, albeit not uplifting. Who's in charge? Who's in charge of everything? If you see what I mean. So who could I talk to that could say yes, that happens and that happens, but when everything's up and running properly, that won't matter because.
Well, no one's taking responsibility. So good question. That's what we're asking. No one's setting scopes. The Royal College of. I don't know if your producer could get in touch and we can send a non-biased just. Like the Royal College of Physicians have had a huge falling out over this. It's completely fractured them.
With each other.
The president had to resign. Well, there was. The president had to resign.
Yes,
there was
I saw that.
There was lots of I think lots of things have happened. And
well, maybe someone listening. Yeah. Okay. Well, we're getting there. We're chipping away. Ailey, thank you.
The GMC is not working either. They're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is keeping the public safe from people claiming to practice medicine. It's a mess. It's a real mess.
Thank you. And thank you for, it can be tough being a whistleblower sometimes, or certainly being at the front of the conversation when you're motivated by a deep conviction, and you clearly were, and other elements of your profession are now coming around to share your concerns, but it must have been quite a lonely business for a while, Ailey, so thank you for that. It's 10 to 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
James O'Brien on LBC.
I'll be quiet for a while, I think. How many times have I said that to you and then completely failed to keep the promise? I have never, I don't think, kept the promise to be quiet, but some subjects I just feel I need to listen. The problem is, as soon as I start listening, you say something and I start asking you questions because I want to understand it even more, but I'll try. Andy's in Norwich, Physician Associates. What's going on?
Hi, James. I love your show, buddy. I think it's awesome. So I've had about 18 years in medicine now, or for various aspects of healthcare. I started off as a paramedic, and then had about 5 years in general practice, and now I work as really what's called an urgent care practitioner, or I always introduce myself a paramedic practitioner in urgent treatment centres or EDs, A&Es. And one thing that I've found is, and also I just felt really deflated listening to your last caller, because that is not what we need. We don't need junior doctors kind of putting Project Fear into people about medicine and healthcare. And it felt very much to me like, no disrespect to your last caller, like she was trying to protect her grade. And I get that. Everyone works hard.
The points she made were strong with regard to scans and prescriptions and things like that.
Yeah, but you know what? I as a paramedic practitioner, I can order scans, I can order X-rays, plain field X-rays.
Yeah, but a physician associate can't.
Well, I think that will come, but anyway, just sort of my point is, so when I left as a paramedic, I think when you turn up on blue lights, people feel very, thank God, paramedics are here.
Yes.
And that's rightly so, because we sort of take over nasty situations. When I went into general practice, I had a very much I would introduce myself as, hi, I'm a paramedic. And they'd sort of raise an eyebrow and I said, I'm not a doctor.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, that's a bit odd. I've come to see a doctor. And I said, I'll tell you what, let's talk about what's wrong. And then if at the end you think my diagnosis, my treatment, or what was done here today isn't right, then I'll make an appointment with a doctor. I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but after a couple of years, people were asking to see me at the practice I was working at.
I can believe you, actually. I see how you're explaining it.
What people say is, Andy, I don't mind that you're not a doctor, because the fact that you're listening to me and the fact that, hang on a second, my last doctor didn't used to listen to me, didn't even used to look up from the screen. And I said, well, that's a technique.
Don't do that, because, you cast yourself as a very good paramedic practitioner. There are very, very good doctors out there as well. So don't compare a very good paramedic practitioner to a very bad doctor, because that's unhelpful. The objective point that needs to be addressed is, I'd rather have a good doctor than a good paramedic practitioner.
I don't think so.
Okay, so persuade me that, because what you can't do is say that doctor over there is rubbish and I'm great. That doctor over there is brilliant. And you're brilliant as well. So you're both brilliant. But I'll have the doctor thank you very much.
So let's say a lot of the ailments that people are going into general practice with, maybe it's minor. So maybe it's what we call a lower respiratory tract, a straightforward chest infection. Now there's only a certain amount of criteria there to diagnose that. It doesn't matter that I haven't studied medicine. I know
this is the point, is that you might be right, intellectually right, but you're not. There's a huge swathe of the population who are going to be terrified by the words that you've just said. It doesn't matter that I haven't studied medicine.
Because of what I've done.
Not on your first day in the job.
If I can just say. So what I've done is I've got to that position almost vocationally. So as 7 years as a paramedic, I've seen a lot of medical emergencies. I've seen also a lot of non-medical emergencies.
Yes.
And then as I stepped into general practice, I had my hand held very much by a good mentoring team that stepped me up into that point where for weeks and weeks and weeks, they would question me and say, we've employed you, but you've got to earn this right to sit in front of somebody to diagnose them and treat them. And I did. So once my doctor, my GP mentor had confidence in me and I proved that, then I was allowed to treat people. It wasn't just a step from the street.
Well, again, that's lucky. That's good, but other experiences in precisely the same space may be different. Why would that GP practice not just hire a GP?
Because, like your last caller said, there's the money. Just the surgeries don't have the money.
So
that
you're
they
cheaper.
Had, so we're much cheaper,
and less qualified.
And less qualified,
and that's why people get scared.
But no less safe.
Well, what other job would you say that in? Airline pilots? Let's just get someone who's less qualified and cheaper, and we'll all feel fine on the plane. What other job would you take that paradigm to and apply it in the same way?
Well, I think that just keep it to medicine.
No, I don't want to. I want to take it to another area of expertise.
Well, we're in front of people and patients because the senior partners of a practice have deemed us safe.
Yeah.
Not just because we've walked in with a
cheap.
grade. Well, more cost effective, but also if we're relating to patients and they feel confident in us and they're happy to come back and see us and they know they're getting good treatment.
No, that's proof of the pudding. I can't argue with that. That's absolute proof of the pudding. But
I think that is the proof of the pudding, isn't it?
Yes, it is, except for the people who are turning up at a surgery scared and being told that they're going to see someone who is less qualified than they were expecting to see, and the main rationale for it is that they are cheaper, and that's the problem. You make a strong case, Andy, and I'm grateful to you for doing so, but it doesn't address the sort of emotional discombobulation coupled with the perfectly logical reaction to being told that this person is less qualified than the person you were expecting to see, and the reason why you're seeing them is cost. I'm afraid I do like the analogy of the airline. I'm sure there are plenty of people who are not senior pilots who think they could do a bang-up job of flying a 747 to Alicante and back. But which one would you prefer in the chair? More on this, I think, because perhaps I'm being unfair.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 3 minutes after 12, and I listen, this is one of those issues where I am flying a little bit blind, to continue the pilot analogy from the last hour, and the testimony we've received from both camps I have found persuasive. Just because somebody is cheaper and less qualified than somebody else does not mean that they are less suited to this specific task before us. Therefore, this diagnosis, this treatment could easily be provided by a physician associate or a paramedic practitioner. But the public confidence in the NHS will be diminished by the fear that you're sort of being palmed off on the cheaper option. And that is part of this debate, which I now have a full grasp of. What I don't have a full grasp of, and possibly won't have at the end of this, but we'll carry on trying for at least a little longer, is whether or not there is a sort of objective metric we can put in place to establish whether or not that line between, they're perfectly capable. You're not in any way, shape or form better off seeing a doctor than a PA or in this specific scenario. Anaesthetism may be slightly different, or rather anaesthetics may be slightly different. But in this specific scenario, there is no way you'd be better off seeing a GP than seeing a physician associate. So let's all crack on. What are the scenarios in which I would be better off seeing a GP, and will the physician associate be minded, confident, qualified to make that call? Which is why so much of this debate circles back to one tragedy, the case of Emily Chesterton, a 30-year-old actress, went to her doctor's surgery with what was diagnosed by a physician associate as an ankle sprain twice. It was actually a blood clot. It travelled from her leg to her lung. It killed her. She thought that she had seen a GP on both of those occasions, but the plural of and no way minimising or in any way seeking to undermine the profundity of that heartbreaking story, but the plural of anecdote is not data. So I trust the doctors who keep circling back to this worst case scenario. Of course I do, but equally, is that a scenario that will be avoided the more commonplace this becomes and the more the system is capable, therefore, of... I don't know. James is in Bath. James, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, James.
Just to address your first question about what would be appropriate for a non-physician to encompass the entire group, commonly referred to as MAPs, or medical associate professionals.
Yes.
That's the thing that's really very challenging, because at the moment there's no defined scope of practice for physician associates.
Right.
They are bringing it into force, but currently, for the last 20 years that this profession has existed, there's been no nationally agreed framework under which these practitioners should be working. Now, as you say, clearly there are some things which may be appropriate for a non-physician to see. But in a general practice or an A&E department, that is an undifferentiated patient group. You don't know if that leg pain is a DVT or an ankle sprain, if that nausea and vomiting is a tummy bug, or maybe there's a tear in a major blood vessel and they are imminently about to collapse. We just do not know. Within anaesthesia, it's a little bit more predictable, because the vast majority of patients, all patients, will go through a preoperative assessment, and if they are felt to be at low risk, no further intervention required, you go straight to your appointment. If there are further investigations needed, they are performed and can be reviewed, and there is an escalation process from a nurse based in the pre-op assessment department all the way up to the anaesthetic consultant with their years of experience and training. And as such, you can be relatively confident that those patients that may end up under the care of an AA would be relatively low risk.
Okay.
It's also a very different model with AAs, where they would work very directly under the supervision of an anaesthetic consultant. So the majority of places would do 2-to-1 supervision, so a consultant would be dancing between two theatres, and there would be rules, essentially guidelines in place to say that they must be present for high-risk periods, which would be going to sleep, to use the layman's terms, waking up, and specific periods during the operation which might be considered higher risk and would be easily identifiable by the entire theatre team, and as such then the anaesthetic consultants in the room. And the comparison to a pilot is really valid, especially for anaesthesia, because I'm sure any pilots listening wouldn't necessarily disagree that takeoff, landing, and, say, turbulence would be high-risk periods where they'll be switched on in the cockpit doing what they need to do. But maybe if there's a period of calm, they flick the autopilot on, have a little cup of coffee, and that's okay.
Or hand over to someone who's training.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The second in command, the flight officer, might well sit there, make sure the numbers look pretty, and if they don't look pretty, they give the boss a shout, and he's in the room in 30 seconds. And that's the model that's very effective across Europe, America. They all use non-physician anaesthetists successfully and largely.
And you're a consultant anaesthetist, are you?
I'm a registrar.
What's that? One step down?
So I've done 15 years of training, and I have a minimum of 4 to 5 left before I'm a consultant.
Okay, and you're speaking up in favour of considerably less qualified people taking up some of the work that you would traditionally be required to do.
There is a role. We know
okay, that's good. That's positive. But the distinction between anaesthetics and physician is crucial in your analysis.
It is crucial, but also it's the way in which it's being introduced. So at the minute, there are less than 200 anaesthetic associates in the UK. They are largely from a background in theatre previously. So they will work as the anaesthetic ODP, so they'll be the right-hand person to the anaesthetist, or they'll work within theatre. So they are fluent in the language of theatre. They know how things work. But what we're seeing with physician associates is not only are they jumping straight from a 2-year course, which may not have any preceding medical training, straight into working essentially at what would be called SHO levels. So that would be a doctor, a minimum of 2 years postgraduate training. But they are then progressing to levels of really high responsibility. So there are examples where a PA has been the consultant on for stroke, making decisions about thrombolysis. They have been on for emergency GI bleeding, so doing the endoscopy.
And this isn't good.
This is awful because just like a pilot, most of the time, you know.
No, I understand, but your bedside manner's so good that you still sound calm when I'm trying to work out whether or not I should be getting concerned, and I'm just double checking that I should be getting concerned because what you just said sounds bad.
You should. So currently there are 3,000 PAs in the UK at the minute, none of which are working under a scope of practice, and none of which are regulated in a mandatory way. There's a voluntary register only, although the GMC are about to change that
in December.
The more significant issue that I have is that those 3,000 PAs currently, the NHS workforce plan suggests we're going to be recruiting 1,500 a year. So that number is going to exponentially increase. You will see more and more PAs replacing doctors on rotas and a dilution of the knowledge and quality of the workforce.
And that is a fear. That is a fear of a sort of dilution is the word I'm looking for of the whole thing. What about on your side of the fence? What about? If I've understood you correctly, then your profession is moving towards a kind of officer class where there will be a reduced number of registrars and consultants and a massively increased number of foot soldiers.
It's a significant concern, not only because of the potential...
Is that an accurate reading of your fears?
So at the same time as the NHS workforce plan says we should recruit 3,000 PAs, we have competition ratios of 3, 4, 5 to 1 for training places in anaesthesia, meaning people spend years and years and years trying to get into a training programme and not infrequently give up and do something else that isn't anaesthesia, whether that's in medicine or not. There's certainly good evidence that plenty of people are leaving the country or leaving the profession. So there is a concern, and not only a risk to patient safety from poor quality care, but you will end up with anaesthetic consultants either supervising multiple people of varying quality and knowledge, but also meaning that they don't get to decompress from the high-risk, high-stress cases.
That's all they're doing. So it would be a bit like me doing an immigration phone-in for 3 hours a day every day.
Exactly. Well, I think you might enjoy that, James. So maybe.
Well, all right. Bad example then. One of those phone-ins where I really have to be on absolutely peak, paying attention to everything for every nanosecond, and I come off air absolutely shattered.
Come on for an interview. That's what you're doing every single day.
That's exactly it. Where you can't afford to make the slightest slip. Wow. Thank you. Can I ask you a silly question?
You may.
How many GPs are there in a place like Bath?
In Bath?
Yeah.
Oh, I couldn't say. So
I just wondered because I know one. I thought you might know him.
Oh, no. unless I've been to visit about my gammy toenail. I don't know.
It's pathetic. I do apologise. 12:13 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. He was good, wasn't he? You'd feel safe if you went in and he was putting you under. Georgina's in Torquay. Georgina, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi.
Hello.
I love your programme.
That's very kind.
I've not rung before.
Thank you.
But I have to ring just because I've got a little bit of experience in what you're talking about.
Marvellous.
My husband has just retired as a GP, just had a heart attack just before his retirement,
but
he's
sorry.
okay.
Oh, good.
I've got one of my sons who is an orthopaedic surgeon in Sheffield.
Okay.
He's nearly consultant. And my youngest daughter opted to be a physician's associate.
Oh, how interesting.
thought, and I'm medical myself,
yes,
and I just thought it'd be quite nice to put a slightly different perspective on it. She went off, you're not allowed to be a physician's associate unless you've got a high first or a 2-1 in a science degree. So you've done a certain amount. She'd done biology in Southampton, went to St George's in London to do the 2-year course.
Right.
And the two of them, this is my husband and the son, were very for her doing it. And her aim was, because she never wanted to be a doctor, because my husband's a workaholic, and she didn't want to live that life.
Okay.
But she did want to work, and she thought about midwifery. He was having its own issues.
Yes.
So she wanted to do something that was being a sort of a cog within the system that would help. And we knew, and I know from the hospital, when you have junior doctors, they do rotations. So you'll get a doctor coming in, say in the August for 6 months or so, then they move, a new one comes. Sometimes within the hospital, if you have something like a physician's associate, they can be within that ward and sort of keep some sort of stability as well. Her aim has never, ever been to replace a doctor.
But she will replace a doctor in some context. That's exactly what she'll do.
They're helping. They are helping to assist within it. Now, she's not working in the hospital. She's qualified, and she works in Clapham in the GP practice, who have been utterly amazing. She gets tremendous support from her GPs there as well. So it's always said when a patient comes in, she introduces herself to who she is, what her job is. No one knows. It even says on her door what she is, and she makes it very clear. She is given a certain amount of autonomy, but she has always got support from the people within the practice.
So if we were looking for
common
ground, for common ground here, it would be that nobody should expect or needs to fear that physician associates are going to replace doctors entirely.
I don't think that's ever been the aim of anything. You've got a huge amount of nurse practitioners who have come in from the nursing system that go into the GP practice and work.
Yeah, but you just heard James in Bath describing circumstances which I think both your husband and your daughter would say no physician associate should ever have been put in, and they are being put in them.
And they're being put in.
Yes.
And I know this is discussions we've had at home.
Yes.
Sadly, my husband's out at the minute, but he would have loved to have joined in. But basically,
we'll do it again.
He feels, they feel that there are some people that are not getting the support they should be having within that profession.
And we're blaming them. We're blaming them for being put in situations that they probably don't want to be put in.
Yes.
Okay, that works.
They should be having support. Now, I was an orthoptist for 30 years.
A whatist?
I worked in orthoptist. Worked with children with squint, adults with double vision.
Yes.
But ultimately, I was never a doctor. I don't want to be a doctor. I was at my own level. I was autonomous within my part of the eye muscles, working under the doctors. But I had my own autonomy.
No, I mean, this is
a similar sort of role.
I hope so. I think I hope you'll take this as a compliment. You've done the best job for this side, for your daughter's side of this discussion, of any of the callers that we've had so far today.
Oh, thank you very much.
No, thank you very much. Are you also retired, or are you still working?
I've stopped. I actually left the hospital because of the NHS crumbling, and they used to keep putting adults at the same time, a different time of children, and the adults took 40 minutes.
So your job became very difficult.
I think it became very difficult. I ended up working with special needs and moving out of it.
Oh wow! So you're still working now?
Just stopped.
You've just stopped. What?
Seeing that?
No, okay. And how's that? Just on a personal level, and a slightly prying. How's it working out? Being at home together all day.
Oh, lovely.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good.
Really
just checking.
I'm actually going on. I'm doing an open university degree, actually. Ooh. So I'm keeping busy that way. My husband's actually doing garden stuff, and he's waiting to have a hip operation. So all in all, things are great.
It's all going on, and your relationship with the NHS continues, but from the other side of the bed.
From a different side, I just see a very sad, crumbling
system, hear you, Georgina.
Which was amazing. And my mother was an orthoptist as well, and started joining. She started at the very beginning, before the NHS, and she's 95 now, and she sees it so depressing because the system should work, but it's just not run properly, and there's not enough staff. And I think the doctors, the nurses, and everybody else within it are trying their best.
And that's the single most important thing to remember. And so we have to presume, not just hope, are the physician associates. So the clouds are beginning to clear, but the concerns, of course, remain. But that was brilliant testimony, Georgina. Thank you. And also, if you'd allow me to say, a little reminder of the kind of levels of enthusiasm and the sorts of personality that managed to keep the NHS punching, even as much of the stuffing is knocked out of it by both circumstances and, I'm afraid, often politics. It's coming up to 12:20.
James O'Brien on LBC.
I love it when this happens. I guess people forget that I can see their tweets. So Seema tweeted a doctor saying, James O'Brien's doing a show on PAs right now. Call in if you're free. And Dr. Bharat Pankania replied, thank you, Seema. I will try and call. And now, on the line from Belfast is Dr. Bharat Pankania. So this is almost like watching it unfold in real time on the red button. Bharat, what made you pick up the phone?
Seema told me you were on.
I should give it a bit of background. You're a senior clinical lecturer at the University of Exeter Medical School. You're 25 years of experience, it says on your bio, in communicable disease control and infectious disease management. I don't know how much of the conversation you've heard. We're kind of working out, A, what's going on, and B, how worried patients should be. So come at it from whatever angle you please, Bharat.
Yeah, so my opening line is that there is a role for everyone in the NHS, including what we now call them physicians associates.
Yes.
I would prefer the term physicians assistant, because the message that is conveyed is, when you say physicians associate, the implication is that they may be a qualified doctor. And then that confusion and worry amongst patients arises. We need people to know who they are and what their scope of practice is. And would you believe it, James?
Go on.
Until recently, nobody in the NHS, nobody in NHS England or elsewhere had written down what a physician's associate can or cannot do. Now that's very worrying, because it is worrying for the PA and it's worrying for patients, because we need to have clear roles defined of what they can do, what they cannot do, what their supervision levels are.
And that is something that can now improve. That's something that is now getting better.
Well, yes, because the scope of practice has been published by the BMA, but it's not the BMA's job.
No.
It should have been done well ahead of employing PAs. How can you employ a PA without knowing
what their job description is?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So on paper, lessen the burden on doctors by helping to manage patients and reduce the demands on their time is far too vague a job description.
Correct. Correct.
And the job description that has been put together, do you have confidence in that?
Well, we can always. It's a what we call a live document, and it should be continuously reviewed.
Right.
They are a team. They will work together as a team. They will be under supervision. They know what to do, and they know what they cannot do, and what they must not do.
And the nomenclature, as you say, the simple naming, having the word physician in the title. And there's been some trouble recently with an advertisement, I think, hasn't there, where
yes,
it very much gave the impression that they were seeking to hire doctors, where what they were actually seeking to hire was associates, physician associates. And you can't say junior doctors, because, of course, that's already a confusing enough and in many ways unhelpful phrase.
Yeah.
What would you call them if you were in charge, Bharat?
I would call them assistant.
Just assistants, yes.
Yeah, and that message of being a physician's assistant clearly says in a short way that they are an assistant. They're not an associate. An associate implies already qualified.
Yes, it does. You're right. I mean, words are important. Speaking of words, can I run something by you? You are absolutely not required in any way whatsoever to comment on this, but it's a story that LBC have literally been investigating on precisely this issue, looking at how many physician associates and anaesthesia associates have been found to have acted illegally in NHS trusts, and the figure that we have found where they've acted beyond their purview, which becomes technically illegal, largely as a consequence perhaps of the move from not having their job properly defined to having their job properly defined. My colleague Conor Hand has found that 1 in 8 NHS trusts have fallen into that into that category, have had PAs and AAs on the books who've acted beyond their purview by trying to prescribe medication or commission ionising radiation scans that they have no legal right to carry out.
Yes, it's very worrying. And look, James, the end point is this results in harm to the patient.
Yes.
So look, if I, as a doctor, did something that was beyond my capabilities, or I am not qualified to do, I would get into serious trouble.
Quite right.
Very, very serious trouble. I would be suspended and all the rest would follow.
Yes.
So it is crucially important that we define what the scope of practice is. And if there have been illegal, they would say, well, we didn't know, so we did it. But now that we've defined what you can and cannot do and must not do, it is important that those parameters are adhered to, because otherwise patient harm happens.
So they're going to, there is some grounds for optimism here, if I've understood you correctly. There's grounds for concern and serious attention, but there is some grounds for optimism here.
Oh, absolutely. So I think a physician's assistant, as I would like to call them,
yes,
has a role in the NHS family. We can work together with them. We need to say, look, with your 2 years of crash course training compared to my 10 plus years of training to be a specialist,
yes,
we define what you can do, what you cannot do, and we review it.
That is really helpful. I think we should both be grateful to Seema for giving you a nod, for giving you a nod earlier this afternoon. Dr. Bharat Padkania, thank you so much for your insights and some more detail on that story, because it is, as I say, an LBC exclusive, finding that physician associates and anaesthesia associates have been found to have acted illegally in 1 in 8 NHS trusts. As we're discussing, the Doctors' Trade Union launched legal action against the General Medical Council yesterday over the regulation of these roles, which don't require either a medical degree or postgraduate medical training. Under the terms of their employment, therefore, PAs and AAs are not permitted to perform acts which are the preserve of clinicians. Their job is to lessen the burden on doctors by helping to manage patients and reduce the demands on their time. However, LBC has found that PAs and AAs have acted beyond their purview in 1 in 8 NHS trusts, attempting to prescribe medication or commission ionising radiation scans, which they have no legal right to do. This data was obtained via Freedom of Information requests to over 50 NHS trusts, and Dr. Richard Marks, the co-founder of Anaesthetists United, has described the figures as staggeringly high. His organisation have launched complementary legal action against the GMC over the regulation of AAs. Speaking to LBC, he warned that the figures could be the tip of the iceberg. Speaking to Bharat a moment ago and to other callers today, if the and this is what I'm taking away at the moment as it approaches 12:30, if this regulation is properly developed and properly recorded, then a lot of the concerns that we've heard, and even the story that I've just reported to you, will become less likely to happen or less likely to be fulfilled moving forward. So as long as the role is really strictly and specifically defined, and the practitioners are in that role are then really strictly and professionally regulated, then it arguably becomes a good thing. Until you start worrying about what I described as the officer class when we were talking to James in Bath about anaesthetists, anaesthesia becoming a profession in which you have a tiny number of people who only ever work on the really big stuff. When stuff goes wrong, they come rushing in, and the rest of it is being done at a relatively lower level, not low. So, still a fascinating conversation, and not for the first time. How has a radio phone-in show ended up being able to attract the kind of calls that we attract? It's an absolute mystery to me. 12:30 is the time. Unhinged headlines to follow the real headlines with Tim Humphrey.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:32 is the time. I mean, I don't know. I can't speak for you, but I'm a little reassured. I guess the crux of this entire conversation has been captured perfectly by Maddie, who's in charge of the clips from the show today. And she's picked up on a couple where Ailey in Belfast was expressing with support a genuine fear that physician associates were trying to replace GPs. And then Georgina, wasn't it, talking to us about her daughter, who is a physician associate. Her husband, a recently retired GP, insisting that there was no desire to replace GPs on the part of the actual personnel who have become PAs. So somewhere between the two lies the truth. 33 minutes after 12 is the time. I was sort of reminded yesterday, I should give some credit. I have done. I've credited him on many occasions, but the inspiration in many ways for the Unhinged Headlines feature is a chap called Roland Smith, who you can follow on Twitter. Roland, no W, he tweets as Roland MCS, but he has made something of a study exclusively, I think, of the Daily Telegraph headlines. And obviously we occasionally, maybe he includes Spectator, we occasionally bring in headlines from elsewhere. But he has made something of a study of the comment pages of the Daily Telegraph, from which we have derived so much joy over the last few years. And he kind of used Twitter last night to establish a form of archive of what he's done. And I thought it might be a nice morning or afternoon even to actually look at a few that we may have missed in recent months. So I guess you could call this, and we'll be back on the physician associate conversation shortly with Sam and with Jane and with others. But I'm going to take a couple of minutes to have a bit of an Unhinged Headline special, although obviously we haven't got a sting that includes the word special, so I'll do that myself.
Unhinged Headlines
Special. Did that work all right? Yeah, that was all right, I think. Okay, so here's a few. These writers are now by words, never mind by lines, for Unhinged Headlines. Sherelle Jacob, writing in the Telegraph today, I think. Britain is about to be pushed over the edge. What? John Redwood. Oh, God. John Redwood's back. Labour and the EU are a match made in hell. But we left you made us leave the EU, John. How can you still be angry with them when you made us leave them? Here is one. This is absolutely extraordinary, from someone called Tim Stanley, who you may be familiar with. Keir Starmer is about to suck the last remaining joy out of Britain. One of these headlines is not true, all right? One of them didn't. Can you guess which one actually didn't appear in the Daily Telegraph? I'll start again. Britain is about to be pushed over the edge, from Sherelle Jacobs. Labour and the EU are a match made in hell, from John Redwood. Keir Starmer is about to suck the last remaining joy out of Britain, says Tim Stanley. Here's one from Camilla Tominey, or is it? Because one of these headlines is made up. Whisper it, but Rishi Sunak is making an extraordinary comeback. A big fan of the word extraordinary, but I mean, every word has its limits. Here's another one on our Unhinged Headline special. Matthew Lynn writes, it's time to undo the damage Macron did to post-Brexit Britain. Pardon? Emmanuel Macron has done damage to post-Brexit Britain. Some of these headlines are so unhinged you almost want to read the article, but only, of course, almost. This facile election, writes Janet Daly, or does she, because one of these is made up, shows Britain's democratic process is a pitiful sham. And then finally, for today's Unhinged Headline special, Alistair Heath writes, or does he, prepare for the dissolution of Britain as a nation state if Starmer wins. These people, if indeed or any of these headlines are, these people have gone absolutely mad. Oh my God, there's another one. I can't stop. Once you start scrolling, you see the next one and you think, I can't stop now. Suella Braverman, who you'll remember has been Home Secretary on several occasions in recent years. Suella Braverman has written an article under the headline, "A vote for Starmer's Labour is a vote for national decline." God save us from national decline, Suella Braverman. Good God, could you imagine anything worse than national decline after the last 14 years of magnificence and sunlit uplands? The mind boggles. I'm going to have to call time on that, otherwise we'll be here all day. So I'll run through them all again very quickly. You have to guess, and you can tweet and text me which one is not true. Okay, one of these headlines is made up. Is it Sherelle Jacobs, Britain is about to be pushed over the edge? Is it John Redwood, Labour and the EU are a match made in hell? Is it Tim Stanley, Keir Starmer is about to suck the last remaining joy? It actually says out Britain. I think the sub-editor was probably still at lunch. Is it Camilla Tominey? Whisper it, but Rishi Sunak is making an extraordinary comeback. Is it Matthew Lynn? It's time to undo the damage Macron did to post-Brexit Britain. Is it Janet Daly? This facile election shows Britain's democratic process is a pitiful sham. Or is it Alistair Heath? Prepare for the dissolution of Britain as a nation-state if Starmer wins. Or finally, is the made-up headline from the Daily Telegraph, Suella Braverman, a vote for Starmer's Labour is a vote for national decline. I shall tell you shortly which one of those is a made-up unhinged headline, but that concludes today's
Unhinged Headlines
Special. I think they won't tell. No one will be able to tell that was just me sticking a special on the end, will they? Back to the altogether more important business of physician associates. Sam is in Barnet. Sam, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. Thanks so much for bringing this subject to the forefront.
Oh, you're welcome.
So I'm a junior doctor. I'm a second-year doctor, so what you call an F2. And I would set the background by saying that there's good and bad in every part of the medical profession. So there'll be really good PAs and there'll be bad PAs, much like there's really good doctors, and I'm sure we've all seen doctors who we think are not so good. And you know, undoubtedly there will be a role for everyone, like Dr. Pankania said. But I think something which you've mentioned, but I think it's actually a national scandal.
Yeah,
is that and what I believe is an intended consequence of the rollout of PAs and the massive upscale of them is actually that lots of doctors, junior doctors, are out of work, and a lot of doctors in my position. So I'll give you a little bit of background.
Of course,
every doctor that graduates from a UK medical school is guaranteed what's called a foundation training place. So you're guaranteed your first 2 foundation years. After that, you're on your own.
Okay.
There is no guarantee of work, right? And I think it's probably a commonly held notion that a doctor's a pretty safe job. You know, you'll always have work. Well, sadly, not in the UK anymore, because the second year foundation doctors will finish their training the first week of August, and a lot of them will be unemployed because there's insufficient training places, and that is in part because PAs and the like are being given preference, and it makes financial sense if you think about it. A junior doctor by nature is a rotational doctor. They change departments between every 4 or 6 months or sometimes a year. So you're not getting longevity out of them. You invest into them. They learn your ways of working. They learn your systems, and then they're gone. Right. Whereas if you get a PA or you get an advanced nurse practitioner, it might be a job for life for them.
Wow.
Right? And the longer they stay there, much like any job, you know, if you've worked in anything, the more you stay there, the more you learn about it, and the more expert you become.
So you're providing positives and negatives while describing the same thing.
Yeah, I see it from a financial point of view. I've spent a lot of time thinking about why is it that they're doing this.
Yes.
And I know you discussed it with the doctor from Belfast before, and it sort of makes sense, right? You train someone up, you keep them in-house, you have them for 30, 40, maybe 50 years.
Yeah.
Right? And not just that, their glass ceiling is at 50, 60 grand.
Right.
If you train that same doctor to consultant level, you're paying them 120 plus grand for the same sort of work, the same sort of job. So from a financial perspective, I see it makes sense. However, again, trying to follow this through to its logical conclusion, what you're going to end up with is, say, 1 or 2 consultants in a department who are sort of supervising a load of lesser qualified people that perhaps have some, a lot of experience, but you're just you're diluting down.
So this is what I've described previously as the creation of a sort of officer class.
Yeah,
which
exactly.
puts possibly unbearable stress on the officers and leaves the patients in the hands almost always of the less quality of the foot soldiers, as it were.
Yeah, and it will
so
be
tell me
up
what.
to those.
So I mean, some of the answer to this might be self-evident, but what's wrong with that in your view?
Well, when it comes to the highly specialised things, or when it comes to making those decisions, who's taking those decisions and who's taking responsibility, who's ultimately culpable? Because I'll tell you something for a fact. When I reach consultancy, if they say to me, I want you to just supervise these 30, 40 PAs and take responsibility for all their decisions, be like, jog on. Absolutely no way. And if I could just mention two things that I think you'll be flabbergasted by. I've seen, and again, I don't have hard evidence, but I've seen anecdotal evidence of second-year foundation doctors who are, and I'll use sort of like air quotes, deliberately failing their second year so that they can extend their contracts just so they have some work.
Right.
Because if you fail, you have to sort of do
Have we got numbers
time.
Have we got numbers on the GP qualified doctors who can't find work? Do we have an overall? Is anyone keeping track of it?
I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Because I know I saw a story recently, I think on Teesside, where it was reported that doctors were visiting, unemployed doctors were visiting food banks. They were turning to charities because they just couldn't pay their bills. That came, I think, from a report from a council in the northeast. It's madness, right? But you've just made me understand this, and that problem is going to get bigger, not smaller, as this goes on, as this rollout goes on.
Well, I've also seen, again, anecdotal evidence of doctors applying for PA jobs.
Because they have job security being told they're overqualified.
Being told they're overqualified.
Because they want to leave and move on to a doctor's job at some point in the... Oh, Lord. I mean, this is an... Is there a... If I said to you, and I asked Ailey this as well... Is there someone we can point to as being the mastermind behind all this?
I was just going to get to that. I would love to say it's sort of the Conservative plan, but I think that'd be giving them too much credit. Yeah. I don't think they're that intelligent, and I don't think they think that far ahead. I honestly don't know where it's come from. I can't tell you. No. It's someone high up in the NHS, but the NHS steeps itself in layers and layers and layers so that you can't find out. Of course. Deliberately.
No, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? The way in which every time we think we found something to feel mildly encouraged by, the next caller comes along and gives us more reasons to be concerned. And listen, it's possible to be both. You can keep two thoughts in your head at the same time. You can be encouraged and concerned by these developments. But that question, I mean, elements that will have shocked you in the course of today's conversation, a growing problem of unemployment among qualified doctors. I mean, that's mad, right? And LBC's exclusive, looking at the number of NHS trusts in which physician associates and anaesthetist associates, I can't say that word, it's going to haunt me for the rest of my life now, have been found to have broken the law because PAs and AAs have been performing acts which are the preserve of clinicians. So that would be concern 2. And concern 3 would be this officer class that we've described. So as if there is, and this is why I was interested in who was in charge or who was behind it or who was the mastermind. Richard puts it well. PAs are a great idea that have been hijacked by financial and political imperatives. Thank you, Richard. That fits with pretty much where my thoughts are coalescing, because problem 3 would be if you have too much of this, you end up with a tiny officer class of supremely qualified consultants who have full responsibility for an almost unmanageable number of less qualified associates as opposed to more qualified physicians. And I think that's pretty close to clarity on what has proved to be an incredibly complicated and, as I say, concerning issue. It is 12:46.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:49 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I mean, I don't know whether it's extraordinary or not, but a couple of you have pointed me towards if not responsibility, then certainly support for this whole practice, this whole phenomenon of physician associates and perhaps the excessive push towards having more of them in the NHS, and you show me roads that lead back to Tufton Street, which automatically sets all sorts of alarm bells ringing. In this case, the Institute, perhaps inevitably, I don't know, the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thank you, though, for bringing it to my attention. Angelique and Louisa and many others. 10 minutes, I'll look into it a little further, of course. 10 minutes to 1 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Shall we conclude our little mystery this week, or our mystery today, of which of the selection of unhinged headlines I shared with you earlier was actually made up? It was, of course, part of... I'm waiting for a guest. Is he ready yet? No, so I'll do this then. Okay.
Unhinged headlines.
Special. They were all real. They were all real. Every single one of them. Even the one about Keir Starmer wanting to suck the last remaining joy out of Britain. If you had to choose one that was made up, would you have chosen John Redwood saying Labour and the EU are a match made in hell in June of 2024? Or would you have chosen Tim Stanley saying Keir Starmer is about to suck the last remaining joy out of Britain? Anyway, you'd have been wrong. They're all real. Every single flipping one of them. This is also a real headline. WikiLeaks founder freed after 5 years in prison. We speak, of course, of Julian Assange, whose journey to prominence began really when he began with WikiLeaks, but the new gear of prominence was achieved when he worked with The Guardian on the publication of incredible amounts of classified information. The editor-in-chief of The Guardian at the time was Alan Rusbridger, who joins me now. Did we know this was going to happen, Alan, or does it count as a surprise?
There had been persistent rumours, but I certainly, it was a surprise to me.
So we understand that he's already left the country. He will go to America and he will plead guilty to criminal charges and therefore go free. People will be wondering why he had to spend 7 years hiding in Ecuador's London embassy, and if this culmination was always in sight. But there are two different issues at play here, I think.
Well, I think what happened was the Australian government suddenly took a much more assertive interest in Assange and pleaded directly with Biden to do something about it. And I think, to be honest, he had become something of an embarrassment all round. I mean, this case was like Dickens's Bleak House case of Jarndyce versus Jarndyce. It was a case that was going to go on for decades. And I think Biden or someone close to Biden eventually thought it's just not worth it. The point has been made. I mean, the worrying thing, I mean, it's clearly good news for Assange.
Yes.
It's a bit worrying that he had to cop to a charge under the Espionage Act. And that's what should worry journalists, because it's it has been very, very rare to use the Espionage Act directly against journalists. And I think that's going to become a more common thing. And of course, the point about that is not only do you do a long time in prison, but there's no defence. You're not allowed to mount any kind of public interest defence.
As in the public interest in the information that you have received and published.
Of course, the government's trying to do this with all kind of protesters now to say you have no excuse. You can't tell the jury why you did it. And that is the case now with the Official Secrets Act in the UK and in the US.
No, that is a troubling precedent. I mean, speaking of Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, in which so famously no one could really remember what the original grievance was, how does Assange's legacy look? I mean, has it become not just complicated, but almost obscured by the subsequent legal battles and the falling out with former colleagues and friends and the accusations of criminality in a very different field from espionage or anything else?
I'm sure it may have done a bit. Yeah. I mean, at the time that he was working with five newspapers he was working with, including The Guardian,
yes.
And the stories we were producing were widely acclaimed to be some of the most important stories, of the century to date.
Yes.
They were about, very vital things like torture and rendition and the behavior of, the American troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. Subsequently, he got involved with leaking a lot of stuff about Hillary Clinton in 2016. He wasn't charged with that, but I think people who had been warmly inclined to him before that began to have their doubts.
What do you think happened to him? As someone who knew him, did his head get turned by all the attention, or would that be an unfair analysis? He just perhaps working to a slightly different agenda from the one many people originally assumed?
Well, when I first came across him, he was in Kenya, and he was leaking, medium-grade stuff about the Kenyan government. I mean, the stuff he was handling later was like kryptonite, and he had the biggest, most scary intelligence services and governments on his tail, and they were determined to get him and to make an example of him. And I think that would have tested anybody.
Okay.
And he was, I think, put under enormous pressure of the sort that most of us can't imagine.
Did we ever find out why Nigel Farage went to visit him at the Ecuadorian embassy?
I don't think we ever did, no. If you find out, please tell me.
I shall let you know. I don't know whether you'll appreciate this, Alan. I think it's more of a dig at me than praise for you, but Phil's been in touch to say, very pleased to hear your guest pronounce Assange properly.
I'm pleased if I did.
Well, I obviously didn't. Alan Rusbridger, thank you. Comments there on the news that the Wikileaks founder Julian Assange has left the UK after reaching a deal with US authorities that will see him plead guilty to criminal charges and go free. But as Alan reminded us, or explained to us, the concern with the espionage charge in particular is that it undermines the future of journalism and protest. If you put them under categories like treason or espionage, you begin to take away, or you even begin and end the taking away of rights that will probably not be shouted from the rooftops by the kind of people who are normally bleating about the supposed erosion of rights. Should we squeeze in one more call on physician GPs? Physician associates. Jane's in Bristol to close the conversation. Jane, what's it going to be?
Hello, thank you for taking my call.
You're most welcome.
It's something that nobody's mentioned yet. My daughter's a salaried GP and has been for 10 years, and she's very concerned about this. And what she told me is the main reason is they don't know what they don't know. They will follow pathways, whereas doctors will go off the pathway and find the more.
It has been touched on, but you've put it better. They don't know what they don't know. No. It's not a criticism. It's just I mean, Ailey will be cross if I don't mention that she did draw our attention to this. And what's brilliant about this, or not brilliant, what's helpful about this observation is that idea of the qualifications will be the reason why GPs sometimes spot something extraordinary.
Yes, absolutely. That and my daughter has done that on numerous occasions. But the annoying thing is, she's a salaried GP, and their salary is not much less than hers.
No.
So.
I mean, hers will rise. An earlier caller explained to us the role that this.
No, not as a GP, because she's not going to become a consultant in a hospital.
But she doesn't want to become a practice owner or anything like that either.
No, because she's got young children. And
no, fair enough. So there is a ceiling. She hits the ceiling.
Evening. Yeah.
So why do all of the training that she's done for a salary that's only going to end up marginally higher than someone who's done a fraction of the training?
Yes. And also if she's just got GP practitioners at the moment. Nurse practitioners at the moment. If they have PAs, she would have to supervise them. And if they do something wrong that she's supervising, she could lose her job.
The buck gets passed up. Well, I'm glad she'll be proud that you've. I hope she's proud and grateful that you've brought this.
Well, I'm very proud of her.
So you should be. Thank you, Jane. I'm very proud of both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's coming up to 1 o'clock. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. This is going to be a bit of a doozy, this topic, you can tell. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick. But now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.